What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. And check out the store linked under the video. It all helps to keep this thing running. But let's get into it. The Majern Pattern Agricultural Support Ship, or as it's labeled by the UNSC, the DCS class, was by far one of the most unusual vessels ever fielded by the Covenant. Introduced during the Third Age of Reclamation, which for all we know could be hundreds of years ago, this class served as the wandering logistical backbone for the Covenant expeditionary fleets, providing everything from food to water, spare parts and maintenance facilities, to even religious administration and recreation. And although it's officially classified as a support ship, the Covenant's military philosophy did not truly recognize the concept of a non-combatant starship. They also treated human ships that way. A true total war concept, there was no such thing as civilians. You're either for or against the Great Journey. And as a result, the Majern pattern was heavily armed by the standards of most logistical ships. At 1,550 meters, or 5,100 feet long, just under a mile, and around 400 meters or 1,300 feet tall, with a mass of 82 million tons, it does fit into this interesting middle ground in the Covenant fleet hierarchy, being just a bit shorter than the frontline warships like the Ket pattern battlecruiser, the CCS, which was 1,782 meters long, but dwarfing ships like the Mouton Et pattern Stormcutter, and even the Ceudar pattern heavy corvette, but still much smaller than the Siphon, the Carroll, and of course the Shawata. Like all the Covenant ships, it uses repulsor engines for sublight propulsion and has that Bohr slipspace drive for faster-than-light travel, which is more efficient, faster, and more accurate than any human equivalent, and it uses the powerful pinch fusion reactor as its primary energy source. And like the rest, it's protected by nano-laminate armor plating and the incredible Covenant energy shield system, with those two defensive measures making up a lot of the greater mass for most Covenant ships. But unlike the usual sleek, predatory silhouettes common to Covenant warships, the Majern has this distinctly, vaguely triangular profile, with this odd curved aft section and these large voids cut out through portions of its superstructure. Still this flowing, organic look, but also unlike anything else we ever see, with four enormous arch-like structures connected to the forward and rear sections, supporting this broad central platform that houses the ship's extensive tertiary assembly forges. These industrial complexes manufactured food packs, maintenance supplies, clothing, small arms weapons, and all of the countless tiny little details that are required to sustain Covenant fleets. It's a Chinese manufacturing district put into a ship, operating completely independently of other established supply centers. They even pumped out so much that they had a lot of surplus production that was constantly being shipped back to High Charity, which would then be redistributed throughout Covenant territory. I wish we had more details on this aspect, but it seems like they're trying to imply that they function more like colony ships, where you could imagine all sorts of sensor data and smaller ships that could go out and actually find the raw materials that were needed to feed these forges. I mean, how else would they operate independently? It's a pretty genius system. Instead of having one enormous breadbasket that feeds the entire empire, like has been a weak point in many empires in Earth history, you have countless of these Majern support ships all throughout the galaxy, all creating your resources locally, but also creating so much that you do still have a centralized point in High Charity. You're kind of having the best of both worlds. By definition, an empire is going to have a capital somewhere, but don't put all your eggs in that Forerunner relic ship basket. Now, a really interesting detail of this class was its pair of enormous, enclosed hunting domes. Human support ships may have had warehouses. They also would have had things like forges, these fabrication facilities, and of course fuel reserves. But Covenant doctrine intertwined logistics with religion and their culture. Like I stress in all these videos, almost all of the Covenant ships, especially the larger they get, they tend to also be these living cities with some sort of religious center in them. And so in that do-it-all nature, these massive domes that we're seeing contain multiple artificial biomes that function simultaneously as hunting preserves, military training grounds, places of worship, recreation parks, and livestock facilities. Kind of like the Halos, it's nice that you could be floating through space in the most high-tech advanced thing imaginable, and yet they're trying to surround themselves with nature that you would find on a planet. These mini planetary environments were usually tailored towards Sangheili and Sanshayum preferences, though there were a ton of these Majourns, so some were actually modified to support other Covenant species. You hope they throw a bone to the Ungoi. But we know for sure that they had at least one that was entirely dedicated to the Legolo, those worms that make up the Hunter. And if we look toward the aft, the rear, we see this towering semicircular structure covered in communications relays and mediator consoles. Again, I'm thinking a lot of this is dedicated to finding raw materials, but that second detail is a part of a system of the Covenant's vast proselytization network, allowing the prophets to communicate across Covenant space. But of course, they were a mix of bishop and warlord, so they were also coordinating military operations and overseeing administrative affairs throughout countless worlds and fleets. It's sometimes hard for us humans to remember this, as we were not offered a ticket into the Covenant. By the time we met them, the higher-ups actually realized that we were the Forerunners, and that would kind of upend their entire racket. They weren't about to hand over those fancy hats, but all other species over hundreds and thousands of years, they were the targets of these proselytization networks. Proselytizing just means to preach to. And you can imagine these ships played a unique role in this missionary work. Funny enough, it's a worry people have with real-world alien theories. But imagine a prophet from the Covenant shows up, provides all this amazing advanced tech, seemingly unlimited food, medical advancements, providing this to some alien world as the cost of admission into the Covenant Empire. Like the Ungoi could attest, not all were equal in this great journey. And if you were brought into the Covenant via a Majourn pattern, it was an excavation beam that was probably keeping you in the Covenant. We do know a specialized variant of this ship, operated by the Ministry of Preparation, which replaced one of its hunting domes entirely with advanced medical and scientific facilities, and these would be dedicated to the creation of prelates, the genetically enhanced warrior servants of the Sanshayum. We usually see this species via the prophets and other scholars, but these prelates are a rare glimpse at our earliest accounts of the Sanshayum species, where they were known as these incredible warriors. Lanky but not frail, this wiry strength perfectly channeled through their technology. As for the Majourn pattern's crew and complement, you could see it's really not intended for combat or taking over some planet. It's listed as having a single precantor, 40 hieromonks, 10 celebrants, and 110 superiors, 20 Huragok engineers, and an enormously high number of 9,800 menials who operate all the ship's various systems and industrial facilities. Covenant ships often have so little crew, it's in the tens of people. So we see just the religious personnel here is like a small school, and there's so many menials or workers to run all those forges. Even though a lot of those systems are automated, well, it's kind of like the worry of tech advancements here. The low-level Covenant worker isn't working any less. If he has 100 AI systems helping him, well then he's expected to pump out 100 times the work. The military personnel were really scarce. Only 7 obedientaries and 150 warriors, originally armed with what's called the vestige carbines, and really they're just there to defend the ship against boarding operations. No matter how good your religious indoctrination of a people are, some of them might get a bit rowdy and show up in the form of pirates, and they felt that this small number of warriors was enough to deal with that. By the time of the late Covenant era, we know that day-to-day operations in this ship were handled by the Ungoi laborers and Huragok technicians, while command authority rested with a minor prophet who served simultaneously as fleet chaplain, logistics coordinator, and political representative of the High Council. Now, like I said, despite its support role, it does still have a surprisingly formidable weapons suite. Again, making sure nobody pirated or make sure nobody took over these abundance machines. And that armament consisted of 8 jet-pattern plasma torpedo silos, capable of launching those guided bolts of superheated plasma that could track targets and inflict catastrophic damage against unshielded ships like those of humanity. And they work just like the plasma torpedoes carried by Covenant battlecruisers and assault carriers, being excellent at long range, and in things like asteroid fields or other obstructed battlefields, which is where you were most likely to be ambushed. Supporting those launchers were 12 Malusian pattern heavy plasma cannon arrays, which were those line-of-sight, unguided, but incredibly destructive plasma beams. And for close-range defense, it has 20 Paleo pattern plasma laser turrets. These were supposed to take out incoming missiles, starfighters, and those boarding craft. So it doesn't have the energy projectors or plasma lances, not the iconic excavation beam, that glassing weapon we see on the larger battleships, but just this thing that makes all the food and clothing. That ship has more than enough power to destroy most UNSC warships. And it doesn't have much of an aerospace complement, but it does have 4 Recicio pattern tick support craft. Maybe if they were annoyed with piracy rising in some region, they wouldn't just want to destroy the ship, but actually board it and take it over, interrogate the personnel, and try and put an end to this pirate faction. And as for its history, it of course played this major role in searching for Forerunner relics and conducting conversion campaigns all across the galaxy, where they're always having to push beyond the established supply networks. Bulk transports and cargo barges could provide raw supplies, and we get an interesting foreshadowing of what we see during the fall of the Covenant, a bit of a skepticism or keeping a distance with the military branch, as unlike most ships, they were not commanded by military personnel. I believe we saw this with the ORS class. If it has O in the name, it's ordained, or uses Forerunner tech, and so the San Shayum leadership tried to keep a closer eye on these assets, and so to get access to a Majourn pattern, you had to get approval from the hierarchs, ensuring that the Covenant's military remained dependent upon the San Shayum leadership, restricting the autonomy of the Sangheili and strengthening this norm of the Prophet's political power. When the Human Covenant War starts, by March of 2526, several of these are seen with the Fleet of Inexorable Obedience during operations against the human colony of Biko, remaining behind at Edelon alongside a 15-vessel logistics group while the main fleet moved on. Spartan-led UNSC forces later attacked the logistics fleet, but prioritized destroying equipment freighters and bladder ships, trying to cut off what feeds these support vessels. In 2531, Majourn pattern ships would participate in Covenant operations around the Forerunner shield world known as Trove, where at least one was destroyed and later consumed by a flood outbreak. But the most famous vessel of this class is undoubtedly the Infinite Succor, attached to the Fleet of Particular Justice during the events surrounding Installation 04, what we see in Halo 1. After a flood infestation aboard this ship, Special Operations Commander Ratas Vadami determined that containment was impossible. To prevent the parasite from escaping the Halo ring and spreading throughout the galaxy, the ship was deliberately sent into the star of the Soel system, which did successfully end this flood outbreak. The operation became one of the most significant Covenant anti-flood actions of the war, and was a great point of commendation for Ratas. And then this class would play a role in the political struggles that preceded the Great Schism. Knowing their great logistical importance, the Prophet of Truth actively courted the minor prophets commanding these vessels, securing their personal loyalty through promises of status and increased privilege, and many of these came to support his increasingly Jiralhani-dominated fleets. And after the destruction of High Charity and Truth's death, many of the surviving Majourn pattern ships abandoned the collapsing Covenant and basically clung to their nearest, highest-ranking San Shayum. Some would be seen in these post-war factions like Jul 'Mdama's Covenant, which did have at least 2 of them by 2558, where these support ships helped repair the heavily damaged Carroll pattern assault carrier Breath of Annihilation, showing that even after the fall of the Covenant, there were still these unique and invaluable assets to any fleet fortunate enough to possess them. So I hope you see what a crucial role these ships played in the Covenant. That's it for its breakdown. Please hit that like button, I really need your help. Check out the shop, tons of cool stuff there from all sorts of fandoms. But most important of all, remember, amateurs talk strategy, professionals use their post-scarcity abundance miracle ships to trap entire species in their ancient alien cult. And may the domain preserve you, always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This breakdown will pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store. It all helps to keep this thing running. But let's break down the Ceudar pattern heavy corvette. Dubbed by the UNSC as the SDV class, it's actually one of the Covenant Empire's most common and versatile escort warships. Though as we'll see, it's dubbed a corvette, but it really does fill a niche role. And measuring 956 meters or 3,135 feet long, and weighing around 8 million metric tons, it is, as you would expect, substantially larger than most human frigates, and gets closer to the dimensions of smaller UNSC destroyers. Like the Halberd class is only around 485 meters, and it's almost up there with the Marathon class. It was originally mass-produced during the 20th Age of Discovery. We have no clue how those ages correlate with human timelines, but it was designed to chart unexplored regions of space and scout dangerous slipspace routes, basically mapping out slipspace highways, which of course was crucial to building an empire, and just overall supported the Covenant military operations. Manufactured by both the Forge Masters of Tanis and the Gorgon Assembly Vault, it quickly became the Covenant's primary escort vessel. And it's because there were so many of these that we see them all throughout the Human Covenant War, accompanying their big brothers like the Ket pattern or the Varric, and the massive Shawada. Built around what is described as a lightweight but exceptionally durable diamondoid and metal matrix composite framework, this is then covered in those layers of nanolaminate hull plating, the armor that makes up just about every Covenant ship. And it matches the overall aesthetic of these smooth, elongated profiles of Covenant ships. But what makes it so easy to identify, and its most unusual structural feature, was what's called the salvage rim, a protective extension of the hull that provided additional armor and could deploy combat carapaces while carrying out combat operations. And while a lot of Covenant ships are based on marine animals, sometimes looking like whales, Covenant engineers were said to have modeled its appearance on the massive Querlith slugs of Suban. Not sure who pitched that to the Covenant Navy, but somehow they got it through. But these slugs must have been pretty impressive. And this ship also had a dorsal landing platform, though that area would be seen as a relatively structural weak point compared to what is otherwise just this robust, thoroughly armor-plated hull. And unlike human warships, whose bridges were often buried deep within the armored sections of the hull, the Ceudar's expansive command center was positioned prominently right below the bow, and that bridge contained an elevated perimeter platform, surrounding all sorts of control stations, and a central hollow tank, and retractable conference table used for commanders and visiting dignitaries. Advanced auspex arrays and proselytization network interlinks allowed rapid coordination with Covenant fleets. You might remember from other breakdowns that this proselytization network, it means preaching network, really shows how the Covenant military and religious aspects were not separate concepts. This ship, like every other ship, was made to bring as many species as possible, except for humans, into the Covenant. It's just that purifying the galaxy often meant using holy fire. And so all these ships have a military and religious role. The ship also had a ministerial cloister for high-ranking officials, and extensive maintenance passages for smaller Covenant species, like the Grunts, but mostly the Huragok, those great engineers that were the unsung heroes of just about every ship. It also had a highly sophisticated automated surgery suite, capable of treating most battlefield injuries. And for defensive measures, it of course had that shielding, but this was a Morelia pattern dispersal field generator, which gave it a full energy shield comparable to much larger Covenant ships. And it also had an Ushab pattern stealth generator, which employed powerful distortion screens and multispectral hypersync technology to render the ship nearly invisible to long-range passive sensors. I've been breaking down a bunch of dedicated stealth ships, which were invisible to both the naked eye and to all sorts of scanners. But you see, even in these things that are just heavy corvettes, not bragging about any purpose-made stealth role, even the Ceudar has a stealth generator, making it exceptionally valuable for reconnaissance missions, infiltrations, evacs, and surprise attacks. You use those other smaller ships that I've broken down for more specialized roles. But the Covenant definitely enjoyed the fact that even during larger offensives, using things like a heavy corvette, they still had a stealth capability. Though it did have a relatively light armament compared to larger Covenant cruisers and battle cruisers. Its primary weapon consisted of 6 Malusian pattern heavy plasma cannons, arranged with 3 mounted on each side of the ship. These provided rapid-fire broadside capability, and were still enough to melt through UNSC frigates. Though far less destructive than the plasma lances, those terrifying beam weapons. But for planetary assaults, it also had 16 Karnak's new pattern plasma bombardment mortars, specialized weapons designed to rain superheated plasma onto surface targets. While for point defense, it also had 11 Fought-Et pattern pulse lasers for shooting down missiles, incoming fighters, and boarding craft. Some variants of the ship, though, also were equipped with low-yield antimatter mines. So you have this corvette with stealth capabilities, that could get in and out and drop down mines. And this entire thing was run by only a crew of 38 personnel, 16 superiors, 20 menials, and just 2 Huragok engineers. This is because it had extensive automation, to the point that its actual minimal crew number is just 10, dramatically lower than anything we see with UNSC ships, with crews often numbering in the hundreds. A piece of lore that I wish was elaborated on more is it said that because it had such few crew, it did not have living quarters. Instead, it would just rotate personnel frequently, but it still wasn't so frequent that it was like a work shift. It wasn't just 8 or 12 hours. It would still be days of deployment. And so the crew made use of all sorts of stimulants and what are called dream shapers. It's this technology that gives you artificial sleep. There's a condition called fatal insomnia, where basically people die because of a lack of sleep. Sleep itself being one of the biggest mysteries of our evolution, we apparently need these shutdown periods, and even these hallucinations called dreams. Apparently, at least the Sangheili did too, and so these dream shapers are actually one of the most horrifying of Covenant technologies. I mean, the glassing a whole planet weaponry is pretty terrifying, but this one's much more subtle. They can just force you to work forever by hopping you on stimulants and beaming in dreams. But beyond its crew, it often had a military complement, usually with 50 obedientaries, 50 warriors, and 130 thralls, making it very effective for boarding actions and landing planetary assault forces, or just occupying some area that was already taken. And it is this troop-carrying capacity that made it so common throughout Covenant fleets, as it could rapidly assist invasion forces while filling this multi-role niche, not needing to be a dedicated troop transport. And of course, it had that hangar facility, this large multi-purpose hangar bay that supported both heavy dropships and medium-sized starfighters, with the usual ships being 8 Seraph Space Superiority fighters, 10 Alceta pattern Banshee strike craft, and 8 standard Banshee support aircraft. And it is this air wing that helped with its offensive ability. Even if it was relatively modest in ship-to-ship armament, you had to deal with all those spacecraft, with Seraph fighters engaging enemy ships, while the Corvette itself remained at a distance under the protection of its stealth systems and its shield. For the troop carriers, there were often 2 Dextro Zur pattern Spirit troop carriers, along with 104 insertion pods and deployment carapaces, all used for rapid infantry deployment. What's even more, as if it needs it, is that these drop pods would benefit from temporary signature reduction as they pass through the ship's distortion screens. You're having those pods move through that sensor jamming bubble. As for propulsion, it had 4 Calipoas pattern repulsor engines, which are said to have given it excellent maneuverability and top speed, with a ton of anecdotes from Covenant commanders saying that they were able to penetrate planetary defenses, carry out their reconnaissance, evade incoming fire, and still close on their targets noticeably quicker than they were with other Covenant ships, even if we don't get objective speed stats. Though it is said to have been not as agile as the smaller Makar pattern, but that makes sense as that was a purpose-made stealth ship. Now it is designated SDV, and the letter S stands for salvation, showing that it took place in cleansing the galaxy with holy fire. Basically, salvation means warship, and like we said, although technically dubbed a heavy corvette, it became one of the Covenant's most important multi-role warships. It had a stealth ability, it was heavily armored and shielded, and had a fighter capacity great for reconnaissance, but also a high number of troops, and the craft to get them planetside, which all helped it play a crucial role in larger fleets, but also just carry out its own independent operations. Now, as for its history, they actually know who built this. It was a Sangheili master shipwright named Chikmu Rabori and the Yanmei apprentice architect Tekche, which is a cool partnership that shows the Covenant's tendency to combine the talents of multiple species, seeing that it produced something that was more technologically advanced than either species developed on their own. One of the most famous named of these ships was the Ardent Prayer, formerly commissioned in the year 2070. We finally get a date on one of these. Like I said, a lot of the Covenant ships have been used for hundreds or thousands of years, but this is said to be one of the oldest of the Ceudar. And even in its earliest years, it was intended to operate far from the Covenant's core territories, used to map unexplored star systems, charting those slipspace routes, and making contact with new civilizations. A lot of the Covenant's first contact was actually via a Ceudar pattern, which is why that proselytization network was so important, broadcasting the Empire's vision of the Great Journey. You pair this up with the Majern, the DCS class, which were like these mobile farms and factories, You could just shower this new species with all sorts of advanced alien technology, and when those who were receptive were rewarded, and those who pushed back were instantly melted via plasma beams, it made for great imperial policy, at least for a while. And like we saw with a lot of other ships, they were assigned to search for foreigner reliquaries, carrying small artifact retrieval teams with all sorts of specialists on board that could survive automated defenses and try not to trigger any of this old foreigner tech, making it out with something that was divine and useful, as these finds would often snowball Covenant power, compounding on each other as you found more and more. But despite this long history and its multi-purpose role, it actually accumulated relatively few celebrated battle honors and is only mentioned very rarely in the official records of High Charity, even as this design became so popular that some Covenant battle groups were composed entirely of SDV-class corvettes. When the Human Covenant War began in 2525, its role immediately expanded, and now they were finding themselves participating directly in frontline operations against their most powerful opponents in lifetimes. Many human colonies, listening posts, and shipyards were all destroyed in seconds due to the Ceudar's stealth tech, and they could often lurk and develop battle plans, like on their attack on the Corbulo Academy of Military Science, where they knew that if they just struck the space elevator first, they could separate all sorts of human resources and then just pick them all off. It might not have had the most firepower, but what it did have, it could direct with deadly accuracy, working on intel that it could gather on its own. Though there is the case of the Battle of Meridian in 2548, where a UNSC prowler was able to evade incoming fire by using its stealth tech. In the last video, we mentioned how human stealth tech was really the only area where we were superior than the Covenant. A sort of counterpunch in the form of a missile barrage hit the Ceudar pattern after the Covenant attack could not lock onto its target, and so the Ceudar just withdrew. The SDV's energy shields made sure that it wasn't damaged, but the Covenant commander was prudent enough to realize that this was just not a fight it was going to win. Then in 2552, during the Battle of Sigma Octantis IV, a ton of these made up the Second Fleet of Solemn Accord, fulfilling just about every role outlined before, from stealth recon to patrol to escort and troop deployment. Though of course their most famous appearance was during the Fall of Reach, accompanying the Fleet of Valiant Prudence. On July 26, 2552, one of these corvettes attacked Oni's sword base, and though it did have a lot of success at first, they were driven back, and was famously shot down by an Orbital Defense Platform's MAC. These Orbital Defense MACs are much stronger than what we see on ships, and that's why even though most Covenant craft would take multiple MAC rounds, even multiple nukes in order to take down their shields, a single MAC from an ODP can one-shot even a heavy corvette like we see here. And then there's the case of Ardent Prayer. During Operation Uppercut, this corvette became the centerpiece of one of the most daring operations in the entire war. While under attack by the UNSC frigate Savannah, the vessel was boarded by multiple FSS 1000 Sabre fighters, carrying Spartan B-312 and George 052. The Spartans successfully captured the corvette and loaded Savannah's slipspace drive on board. Then they directed the hijacked vessel toward the Covenant supercarrier Long Night of Solace, the flagship of the Fleet of Valiant Prudence. When George manually activated the drive, it generated a catastrophic slipspace rupture that destroyed both the Ardent Prayer and the supercarrier. The Long Night of Solace taken out, it proved to be one of the most significant UNSC victories of the entire war. And throughout Reach's final days, several of them are seen during the siege of New Alexandria, one positioned above the starport, using its weapons to prevent civilian evac, and after it destroyed a desperate transport trying to flee, Spartan B-312 activated a nearby missile battery and launched a strike against the corvette, inflicting severe damage, forcing the vessel to retreat, and allowing thousands of civilians to escape. And after the fall of the Covenant, these became highly prized assets among the many different successor factions that emerged. Jewel Madama's Covenant maintained several, but so did the Swords of Sanghelios. Doing this complete 180, and in Operation Farstorm, these were transporting joint UNSC Sangheli task forces through the accession to Installation 00, the Ark. In 2558, we see them with the mercenary leader Vada Gajat, serving as the flagship of his private fleet, and a Kigyar pirate queen operating from Vend 3 also had this as her flagship before it was destroyed during Operation Whistle Stop. The Banished had Elegy's Lament, and finally what is dubbed the Silver Timeline. the Halo show, two Sangheili warriors who discovered Meiki on Oban arrive aboard one of these corvettes. Later, she traveled through the 23 Libre system aboard a damaged SDV, and by feigning distress, she convinced the UNSC destroyer Gladius to bring her aboard, allowing her to infiltrate the human vessel with a hidden Lekgolo colony. Another SDV served as the flagship for Arbiter Val Gattani during his hunt for Halo, though it was ultimately destroyed after crashing on Installation 04. And no less than 60 Ceudar were within the first fleet of Solemn Accord, where one of these was captured by Spartan 3s and rammed into the fleet's Siphon pattern assault carrier, and averages across these battles would show that about 3 UNSC warships were lost for every Ceudar pattern that was destroyed. So that's it for its breakdown. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. I could really use your help. And check out the store, there's all sorts of cool stuff. But most important of all, remember, advanced alien tech isn't free, and may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store link down below. Let's break down the Maekar Pattern Light Corvette. Designated by the UNSC as the DAV class light corvette, it's one of the Covenant's most specialized reconnaissance and infiltration ships. It's technically classified as a corvette, but it really does occupy a unique niche within the Covenant Navy. Rather than serving as a frontline combatant like the larger Ceudar pattern, it's more of a stealth platform used for intelligence gathering, for surveillance and artifact hunting, and the insertion or extraction of Sangheili Ranger teams. It first entered service during the Covenant's Third Age of Reclamation, and would continue to serve well into the post-war era. Measuring 485 meters, or 1,590 feet long, and 202 meters, or 660 feet wide, and with a mass of around 5 million tons, it made it almost identical in length to the UNSC's Halberd-class light destroyer, though like we keep seeing, it is about 2.8 times more massive, more weight in there from all the energy systems, the denser armor, and the tech for the weapons and shields. While significantly smaller than things like the Ket pattern, which is almost 1.8 kilometers, it's still larger than many UNSC frigates, while maintaining that Covenant aesthetic with these sleek, organic, marine animal-inspired silhouettes, moving through normal space with repulsor engines, and having that Ceudar Slipspace drive for faster-than-light travel that was quicker and more accurate than anything humanity had. For navigation and recon, it did have a Luminary, one of the Covenant's most prized sensor systems. These were reverse-engineered Forerunner devices capable of locating Forerunner relics and installations, which is just another example of how the Covenant's religious view shapes their military. Almost all of their ships primarily serve an archaeological function. They are trying to find Forerunner relics and bring all the new species they meet along the way into the fold of this great journey. It's just that some people resist, and so you need shielding and weaponry. But by far its most distinctive feature was the Ushab pattern stealth shroud, a very sophisticated cloaking system that put the Maekar among the greatest stealth ships ever fielded by the Covenant. Unlike the active camouflage system used by Sangheili infantry, where they might go invisible to our naked eye, just this faint warping that gives them away, this Ushab system combined powerful distortion screens with multispectral hypersync networks, making this thing invisible across all sorts of wavelengths at the same time. Not just to our human eyes, but to all sorts of sensors that are meant to pick up every wavelength. And so it was invisible to sensors and the naked eye. Really stealth ship perfection. Similar stealth technologies appear on dedicated Covenant stealth ships operating around worlds like Sigma Octantis IV, but the Maekar represents one of the few fully armed warships designed around this concept, allowing it to infiltrate planetary defenses, sit there and just spy on hostile fleets, relaying intelligence to all sorts of allied fleets and ground teams, and just deliver the perfect targeting data for incoming Covenant armadas, allowing Covenant commanders to just pick out their targets before the defenders even realized an invasion was happening. But because it was optimized for stealth, not really intended to be in direct combat, its armament is relatively modest, with a primary weapon of a single Arcan pattern plasma beam emitter, a directed energy weapon comparable in purpose to the plasma beam projectors, which we're used to seeing on the much larger ships, but even these were capable of just melting through Titanium A battleplate armor. Supporting that were 4 Malusian pattern heavy plasma cannons, which launched magnetically accelerated plasma bolts capable of overwhelming energy shields, and again were usually strong enough to get through humanity's defenses. The larger Ceudar pattern heavy corvette had 6 of these, and just had a greater overall weapon suite, but still the Makar's weaponry was enough, especially when you consider that it could just pick the perfect place to strike, being absolutely invisible, and then opening up with a volley against our unshielded ships. We don't know the exact complement figures, but it did carry facilities for both dropships and strike craft, giving it the ability to deploy reconnaissance teams, the Rangers, and so-called Special Operations personnel. So you could have your invisible ship dropping down their Sangheili with active camouflage. And yet humanity still won the war. Most would go through the Human Covenant War without even knowing this ship existed, kind of like the exact opposite of the ubiquitous Ket pattern, the CCS that was familiar even to naval cadets, hell, even to most civilians. And you can only imagine how many lives were lost just in an instant as fire erupted out of seemingly empty space, taking out some crucial UNSC listening post or a small group of human ships. One of the most notable of this class was named the Lookout, formerly known as Infinite Fire during its service with the Covenant, but in the post-war era, after the collapse of the Covenant, the Lookout entered service with the Swords of Sanghelios and became part of a rare cooperative effort between Sangheili and human authorities. It's actually how most humans even found out that this thing existed. Its crew included Sangheili, Ungoi, and human personnel working together to reconnect isolated colonies that had been cut off during the war. In 2553, it arrived at the human colony of Losing Hand, accompanied by the survivors from a cargo vessel UNSC Dark Was the Night, which had crashed on the world a year earlier. You can imagine that with long-range comms destroyed, some areas spread all across the galaxy were not even aware that the war had ended. Imagine the surprise when they find out that we are working with the Sangheili. Major Kyle Stallock briefed the stranded crew on the events that had happened since their crash, including the end of the war, and these dramatic political changes, and the colonists and survivors were offered transport away from the world, though some did choose to remain behind. And in this post-war era, it also was used by Covenant splinter groups. During the Battle of Boundary, Makar pattern corvettes belonging to Sally Neon's Covenant would take part in fighting off the allied UNSC forces, and one of these Makars crashed into the planet's surface, and would become the site of some Sangheili on Sangheili violence. There isn't really much more about this ship, but it was just too cool it had to get a breakdown. Maybe it's something we'll see used more in future Halo media. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. It really does help keep this series going. Check out the store link down below, but most important of all, remember, if the Covenant's enormous ships weren't terrifying enough, just remember every empty spot in space might actually be hiding a ship that could melt away your armor in seconds. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store. But let's break down the simply named Intrusion Corvette, which was used by both the Covenant and Banished. It looks like something more from Star Wars. I couldn't track this down, but even the art style looks like what you see in a lot of the Star Wars RPG guidebooks. And nothing here really looks like a Covenant design, which is why I would rather use images of this, the ship based on the Intrusion Corvette described in the Halo novels Silent Storm and Oblivion. What you're seeing was created for the Sins of the Prophets mod, a mod that has been crucial to this Halo ship series. But in that mod, they dub it the Tycel pattern DRV Intrusion Corvette, because yeah, the official one doesn't even have a proper name. It really is just called the Intrusion Corvette. So technically these images are fan-made, but I think they were made with even more love, passion, and accuracy than a lot of the official stuff. But just wanted to mention that at the beginning before we dive in. And because there is so little information on this, the simply named Covenant stealth ship, let me knock that out in less than a minute. This was a compact reconnaissance vessel designed primarily for intelligence gathering and covert infiltration operations used during the Human Covenant War. Measuring smaller than a UNSC Halberd-class light destroyer, so less than 485 meters, it relied on advanced repulsor engines and was equipped with a sophisticated suite of surveillance and electronic warfare systems, which included a laser-guided transceiver, guidance control jammers, and a top-of-the-line stealth package, while of course being protected by nanolaminate armor and that protective bubble of shielding. Rather than engaging enemy fleets directly, stealth ships were usually deployed ahead of major Covenant offenses to penetrate a world, gather intelligence, jam up the enemy comms, and then relay crucial targeting intel to the invasion forces. It's described as lightly armed and only modestly protected compared to larger Covenant warships, though it did have active camouflage technology, so maybe it's something like the Makar, where it was both invisible to the naked eye, but also undetectable by all sorts of equipment, while also having that electronic countermeasure system to actively jam that equipment and prevent the detection of other Covenant ships. A stealth ship which itself was undetectable and could help make its allies undetectable. And we get specific details that it could scramble incoming Archer missiles, which after the Mac rounds were the UNSC Navy's most common ship-to-ship weapons. One of the most notable examples of this class operated during the Battle of Sigma Octantis IV in 2552. And during that battle, ground forces successfully transmitted data recovered from a Forerunner artifact to a stealth ship in orbit. But before that ship could escape with the intelligence, it was intercepted and destroyed when the UNSC destroyer Iroquois deliberately rammed the craft, making sure that data didn't get into the hands of Covenant leadership. Okay, with that very quick stealth ship breakdown, now we can do the intrusion corvette breakdown proper. This was a specialized class of stealth corvette employed by both the Covenant and later the Banished. And unlike the larger and more heavily armed warships that form the backbone of the Covenant Navy, things like the CCS, the Ket pattern, or even down to the smaller Xanar pattern light cruisers, you had these intrusion corvettes which filled a similar role to the UNSC's Razor-class prowlers. And this is one of the very few times where Covenant commanders would even acknowledge that UNSC stealth tech was actually superior to theirs in some respects. Almost every other piece of technology, from slipspace drives to the shielding to the armor and weaponry, the aliens had more advanced tech than humans did, but for some reason, there were some cases where UNSC stealth tech was superior. They are described as having a distinctive silhouette, consisting of twin, teardrop-shaped hull sections connected by a narrow central fuselage, with rows of blue lights spread across the hull plating. And unlike the thick nanolaminate armor and immense energy shielding carried by Covenant capital ships, the intrusion corvette's hulls sacrificed durability, putting all their skill points into stealth and agility. Covenant commanders knew that if they were hit, this could be an easy kill for the humans, but that should be almost impossible. Though of course in a nearly 30-year-long conflict, this did happen during the Battle of Ceudar, where several of these were destroyed by missile attacks launched by UNSC Razor-class prowlers, our superior stealth ships. And so yeah, while maybe a larger, less specialized capital ship might not be able to target an intrusion corvette, the great stealth ships that were the prowlers were able to destroy several of these. The Banished heavily modified the design after the Covenant's fall, and that one and only image we have is of a heavily modified Banished version, which often had reinforced ramming spikes, an even more expanded sensor suite, external boarding craft, and customized paint schemes reflecting the owner's status, and even displaying all sorts of accomplishments. The most famous example belonged to War Chief Iskarum, whose personal vessel carried the blood-red colors and insignia of the Banished above its bow. And all these modifications reflected Banished military doctrine, which emphasized aggressive boarding actions and direct assaults. But it's a funny application of this supposedly much more weak, on both offense and defense, ship that was supposed to be for stealth operations, really proving why the Jiralhani were called the Brutes. Power and propulsion systems were described as the typical sort of things you see in other Covenant ships, but somehow the repulsor engines used for sublight maneuvering were designed in a way to have a remarkably low emissions profile, having a nearly indetectable thermal output, appearing as a brief red flare on thermal sensors before vanishing completely. Combined with an advanced active camouflage suite, it all allowed them to infiltrate heavily defended regions. And during the approach to Ceudar in 2526, many of these corvettes successfully bypassed the entirety of Biko's orbital defenses, without a single one of them being detected. Covenant Commander Nizat Kavarosi estimated these stealth packages to be about 85% effective when properly maintained. Basically, a 15% chance that even the best of human tech would be able to pick up on this specialized stealth craft. But it was a very finicky system, and degraded maintenance conditions could reduce effectiveness to between 50 to 75%, and so you can imagine they became more and more detectable over the course of the war. A comment by a Covenant commander, Tel Dezatulai, is where we get the detail that UNSC Prowler tech is superior. It seems to be more reliable, less finicky, and so in practical applications, in actual combat where everything isn't working as properly as you hoped, it seems like you had an even smaller chance of detecting a Prowler. We also know that this ship's electronic warfare systems centered around the Calgid navigation and sensor suite, which was sufficiently valuable that Spartan IIs later recovered one from a destroyed corvette and delivered it to Dr. Catherine Halsey for study. And we get more details on Prowler's superiority, and that they did not detect the launch of several Prowlers during operations around that same world of Ceoba. And this ship actually has a respectable armament, its primary weapon being a single anti-ship plasma cannon. We don't get the actual name of it, but unlike the plasma lances found on major Covenant capital ships or the heavy plasma torpedo launchers, these were really used for ambush attacks and precision strikes against enemy ships. This is a pretty common thing across all sorts of Covenant stealth ships, that they know they can just wait for the perfect opportunity, striking at the one crucial system, and so they didn't need as much firepower. Though in addition to that weapon, it also had light plasma turrets for point defense duties, shooting down incoming missiles, fighters, dropships, or other small craft, as the Covenant really didn't want this ship to fall into enemy hands. Trying to reverse engineer this, which is exactly what Halsey's plan was with the Spartans, when they stole that Calgid sensor suite. And the ship also has significant troop deployment capabilities. Gravity lift systems, like we see on much larger ships, would allow you to lift or deploy personnel, vehicles, and cargo, and they were powerful enough to try to recover the crashed UNSC Prowler Starry Night. Each side of this war was trying to steal each other's advanced stealth craft. These ships usually had several Karo Etba Ghost reconnaissance vessels and dozens of Covenant warriors, making them ideal for Spec Ops missions. Multiple breaching carapaces also allowed it to conduct its own boarding actions against enemy ships. This craft that was invisible to the eye and undetectable by any sensors could just shoot out your engines and launch boarding craft within seconds, seemingly out of the emptiness of space. Banished variants expanded upon that even further, carrying phantom dropships and all sorts of other boarding craft mounted along the ventral hull. Of course, it's far less capable than the dedicated assault ships and assault carriers, but it's still definitely unique and a dangerous platform for inserting strike craft behind enemy lines. And it said that this whole ship could be run with just 14 crew members, with the bridge organized around a compact command structure with a ship master and second in command, supported by 10 readers and 2 obedientaries who monitored data feeds around a central tactical hologram. The bridge itself featured an observation blister, allowing for direct visual observations of space, while the aft section housed a dense network of consoles and information systems. So all sorts of data inputs, from your naked eyes to scanners of just about every kind you could think of. And it also had a contemplation sphere within its spine, where high-ranking Sangheili officers could meditate in accordance with the Covenant traditions. While on the upper side of the ship was a hangar and cargo complement large enough to accommodate a captured Razor-class Prowler. For its operational history, I already talked about how it was used at Ceoba, this stealth arms race with both sides wanting to capture each other's stealth tech, going so far even to have the Starry Night self-destruct in order to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. And later in 2526, the disgraced Sangheili commander Nizat Kavarosi would seize several of these ships and form the Flotilla of Aung Sung Piety in an attempt to restore his honor through a campaign against the Office of Naval Intelligence, Oni being the ones to command all these stealth ships. During the following Battle of Netherop, most of these ships were destroyed by the combined efforts of UNSC Task Force Pantea and the Covenant Fleet of Swift Justice, which had been dispatched to eliminate the rogue commander. Only the ships Silent Truth and Quiet Faith survived the battle. But others of this class would continue to serve after the Covenant's collapse. In 2559, the brute Escarum used his personal intrusion corvette during several important banished operations, even during diplomatic negotiations with the new colonial alliance, aboard the ship dubbed the NCA de Aragnan. Then later they would be a part of banished operations on Reach, where it deployed Escarum to oversee the search for the Menakite portal complex, where they would extract Atriox and his forces right before the arrival of a Guardian Custode. And so Atriox was a beneficiary of this specialized stealth, intrusion, and evac ship. This thing doing exactly what it was designed to do, carrying out a specialized operation, getting in and out safely. That's it for its breakdown. Thanks for watching. Please hit that like button. Check out the store link down below. But most important of all, remember, in high-tech space warfare, empty space could kill you. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store link down below. It all helps to keep this series going. Let's break down the Esther Pattern Armored Frigate. Designated by the UNSC as the CAR class frigate, it entered service in the Third Age of Discovery and would remain in operation through the Covenant's final centuries. Like we see with a lot of these UNSC ships, they are used for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and over all that time it would prove to be one of the most versatile, but relatively unknown and an unglamorous component of the Covenant Navy. It has all your standard stuff like nanolaminate armor, repulsor-based propulsion systems, and a Ceudar Slipspace drive for faster-than-light travel that was more accurate and quicker than what humanity had. Measuring 1,000 meters or 3,280 feet long, with a mass of around 34 million tons, it is at the upper end of what the Covenant usually considers a frigate. And by UNSC standards, it was an exceptionally large vessel. Many things like the Charon-class light frigate only get up to 490 meters long, and even the Paris-class heavy frigate was about half the size. The Esther gets closer to the dimensions of UNSC cruisers, but compared to its fellow Covey ships, it's just a bit longer than the Ceudar Pattern sword frigate, and right around the Ceudar Pattern heavy corvette. And although considered rather ordinary and unremarkable amongst the Covenant fleets, for weaponry it had a single Bain-Ka pattern plasma lance, a heavy energy weapon more commonly associated with higher status Covenant ships. These were of the most feared naval weapons, capable of concentrating immense amounts of superheated plasma into these devastated focused beams, which just boiled away 6 feet thick sections of titanium A battleplate armor. And so putting a weapon like this on the Esther was considered unusual, and did help it punch above its weight, even if just about all Covenant weaponry easily melted through UNSC armor. But supporting that were 2 Anteros pattern plasma beam emitters. These are pretty commonly found among all sorts of Covenant capital ships, and these provided sustained energy attacks for both ship-to-ship and planetary targets. And it also had 30 Say pattern plasma cannons, forming the backbone of its sort of broadside firepower. These plasma cannons projected bolts of magnetically contained plasma. It's the same tech, just on an enormous scale of what we see in the plasma pistol, and these would just burn through human ships, but were also great for eventually overwhelming shielded targets. As we saw in a lot of these other ship breakdowns, there's always this aspect that's hinted at in the lore of how difficult it was to keep the Covenant Empire together. For all the talk of religious harmony on this great journey, there were always species that were fighting to get out from under the San Shayum rule. And last but not least, it also had 4 Font-Et pattern pulse lasers, usually employed for point defense duties, intercepting incoming missiles and engaging smaller craft, like bombers or boarding craft. Though we do get a cool detail that individual shipmasters and crews were known to heavily customize their armored frigates, with all sorts of tertiary weapon systems, basically mission-specific loadouts. And so while very capable, it just was always used in secondary roles, and so it never really accumulated the prestige before the Human Covenant War, during it, or after. And the prestige of the ship that you captained played a huge role in the Sangheili honor system. So sadly, no one really cared if you were commanding an Esther pattern. But if they were honest, they knew that it did play an important role in the Covenant's vast administrative and military infrastructure, ensuring that newly subdued worlds were cataloged and monitored after the more glorious ships of the main fleet had moved on. And we can infer a bit from its UNSC designation, with the R standing for reverence, indicating that the vessel possessed capabilities associated with reconnaissance and recovery, or excavation of Forerunner artifacts. You can look at their entire military as serving this primary role of collecting Forerunner tech. It's just that on that mission, it meant you had to come in contact with all sorts of alien species, and they had to be brought into the Covenant or purged with holy fire. And so like we saw with a lot of other Covenant ships that have R in their designation, it would support those ships during exploratory expeditions and archaeological operations that would often require combat. And although usually employed in supporting roles, we do know of several times that they played a crucial role in major wartime operations. Several of them are seen during the Fall of Reach, and by the time of the Great Schism in 2552, Many Eastern pattern frigates were stationed around the Covenant capital of High Charity, as it transitioned from the traditional Sangheili crews to predominantly Jiralhani personnel, as the prophets came to favor the brutes. And when civil war erupted within the Covenant, these frigates became part of the forces used against Sangheili separatist fleets, which is where its weapons' ability to strip away shielding really did come in handy. Though of course, if you zoomed out, this was just the most violent and the most impactful of what could be seen as a series of smaller rebellions, smaller conflicts that could have turned into this larger civil war. That's it for its breakdown. This is another one that really doesn't have a lot of lore, but I just felt it was too cool to ignore. Please hit that like button, check the store, but most important of all, remember, if your military makes sure that your ship can take out friendly ships, your empire might not be as secure as the fancy hats tell you it is. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, check out the shop link down below. Let's break down the Ceudar Pattern Heavy Destroyer, or as it was dubbed by the UNSC, the CPV class heavy cruiser. It's one of their best destroyer-grade warships and has been in service since the Second Age of Conflict. We have no idea when that was, how that correlates to our human timeline, but most Covenant ships that we see have been serving for hundreds if not thousands of years, and it would continue to serve into the post-war era. At 1,664 meters, or just about a mile long, in 1,350 meters or 4,400 feet wide, and weighing around 115 million metric tons, it's considered a destroyer amongst its Covenant peers, but it's much larger than human cruisers and even battle cruisers. But it is even close to the Ket pattern, with the CCS being about 1,782 meters, and it's far larger than the Wick pattern light destroyer, though they have nearly the same loadout. It does have the iconic Covenant look, these organic flowing curves, but it's still unique and you never really confuse a Ceudar with any other ship. With that broad teardrop shape that curves downward into this massive bulbous structure, which houses the ship's primary weapon, the Infernus pattern super heavy excavation beam. Called an excavation beam because originally these were just archaeological devices, tools to help find Forerunner sites, like we see a bit of with the portal at Voy on Earth. Above that section lies a recessed dorsal feature known as the Furnace, which was a dedicated pinch fusion reactor specifically designed to free enormous amounts of energy into that beam. So while many ships have an Infernus pattern, this has a whole dedicated reactor just for that weapon, and that's why it has such a unique look. Toward the stern, the ship divides into 6 elegant wing-like projections which are characteristic of the Covenant look, and these structures have additional reactor systems and all kinds of propulsion assemblies. Like most Covenant ships, the frame is made of advanced diamondoid and this metal matrix composite skeleton that's coated in nanolaminate armor, all actually put in place by programmable construction nanomachines when these are fabricated in those enormous forges. So that, combined with the energy shielding, is what made Covenant ships far more durable than their human counterparts. Even if they were the same size or even much smaller, human ships were magnitudes easier to destroy. And like most Covenant ships, it also had a pretty small permanent crew, due to extensive automation and the use of Huragok maintenance specialists. Standard operation required only 4 superiors, 2 Huragok engineers, and 400 menials, so a total crew of 406. But there's a funny detail that we learned that not a lot of people wanted to serve on this. It had an unusual reputation. There really wasn't much glory attached to this. The Ceudar was associated with this singular focus on destruction and just punitive warfare. Most of the crew were people who had failed at some other duty, and they were just sent in when overwhelming force was deployed. When the Covenant didn't think there was any brains needed here, they knew they would win the battle. This was just the exterminator crew. Sent in, press the buttons, kill the enemy. You didn't really outsmart the enemy in some epic space combat with some complex capital ship maneuver. You just pressed the buttons and glassed the enemy. But this also meant that a lot of these crews who did not just give up on themselves would try to apply the Ceudar in all kinds of novel ways, desperately hoping to regain some honor. And for when he needed boots on the ground, their military complement was 50 obedientaries, Sangheili warriors often undergoing training for future command positions, 100 warriors, and 1,900 thralls, so over 2,000 boots on the ground. And it had a pretty significant aerospace and ground warfare contingent. with numerous Seraph fighters, Banshee attack craft, and Vampire fighters, and all kinds of combinations of your normal ground vehicles, like the Ghost and Wraith. Much less than an assault carrier, but it still could deploy entire armies, even as a shuttle moving resources from much larger craft, things like the Siphon or the Carol. What's more is that this Infernus system had this magnetic confinement system where the plasma streams could be focused. That's how we usually see them in these sort of death ray melting, glassing the surface role, but they could be broadened to this enormous cone of radiating death. Think laser beam if you really want to melt things, but think just like an enormous spotlight that is strong enough to kill all the people in its path, but maybe it leaves the buildings and terrain intact. Supporting the primary weapon were 40 Carnax Et pattern plasma bombardment mortars, extraordinarily heavy planetary bombardment batteries, with 5 mortars mounted on each side of the central reactor, allowing for a much longer, continuous bombarding of this devastating fire. And the whole point of this is just to deliver as much damage over as wide an area as possible, even used regardless of the Covenant troops on the ground. For ship-to-ship combat, it had 2 Aldrodon pattern plasma beam emitters, weapons designed to overwhelm shields and boil away those sheets of armor on human ships. And those are supplemented by 24 Malusian pattern plasma cannons, spread all across the ship's hull. Several are mounted in the forward section, while others are at the wing structures and on the lateral hull surfaces, and these are its primary medium-range anti-ship weapons, delivering those superheated plasma strikes that humanity came to so fear. And then really for defense, it had 20 Gone pattern pulse laser turrets, serving that point defense, anti-starfighter, missile intercepting role, taking out any possible boarding ships. And this armament is often compared to the Wick pattern light destroyer because it seems like an insult to the Cenaris that it has the same armament as a much smaller ship, but the point is that these are connected to their own dedicated reactors. You use the Wick pattern for much smaller threats, where you could quickly eliminate the enemy, but the Cenaris gives you all that firepower for much longer, allowing you to really bring hell to the enemy, melting away their whole world. It would become synonymous with the large-scale glassing operations. And it's for this that it would also get another proper designation as an executioner category of warships, which, while we might see the prophets as bloodthirsty religious maniacs, this was actually an intense point of debate. Most of the hierarchs viewed ships devoted entirely to combat. They actually thought it threatened their entire empire. All the other ships could hide behind this idea that they were just for exploration, for the religious purpose of the Great Journey. Things like the Ket pattern's primary role was just to uncover Forerunner artifacts, and it just had this other function that it could defend itself. But the Cenaris was so designed for pure destruction that some of the hierarchs thought it might lead to some of the hierarchs thought it might threaten stability on High Charity, flaunting the fact that to all these other member species, they were essentially ruled through force. And it would never be produced in great numbers, nothing close to the ubiquitous Ket pattern or even the Carol and Elephant pattern. But they're so memorable because they are connected to some of the most tragic moments in human history, even in the earliest stages of the war. With their arrival at the agricultural world of Harvest in 2525, Covenant cruiser Rapid Conversion, a hilariously ironic name since conversion was never actually extended as an option for humanity, but that ship would lead the assault, and Cenaris destroyers would repeatedly glass territories that were retaken by UNSC forces, creating this brutal cycle where any human gains were quickly erased. This once breadbasket world of Harvest became this lifeless, scarred testament to the Covenant's power. During the Battle of Arcadia, then Captain Terrence Hood would try to engage one of these destroyers, but it was just one of countless cases where a single Covenant-heavy destroyer could threaten entire UNSC task forces, and he just had to withdraw. One of the most famous named of these ships was Proclamation's Tithe, which appeared at the Shield World Itran Harborage. It engaged the UNSC carrier Spirit of Fire after these two collided. They launched intense boarding actions with Sangheili infantry, Banshee squadrons, vampire fighters, and raining down supporting plasma fire. And during the Battle of 18 Scorpii in 2543, a single Cenaris nearly annihilated all of Battle Group Sierra 3. They were just lucky to be aided by the odd ally of the insurrectionist fleet, led by the modified frigate Bellicose. Together, UNSC and insurrectionists were able to repel the Covenant destroyer. And then they were seen during the Battle of Sigma Octantis IV and the fall of Reach. With all the losses the Covenant took over Reach, they made sure that humanity understood that its second most important world was thoroughly destroyed. And after the Covenant collapsed, in 2557, the destroyer Radiant Perception was investigated by Ryan Forge, who found evidence that the ship had recovered a log buoy from the long-lost Spirit of Fire. And tracking this down led him to the world of Laconia, where they recovered information critical to locating the missing UNSC ship. Former loyalists to Thelvatum and the Jiralhani chieftain Lydas all used Sonaris destroyers during the Battle of Elan IV, and their last major appearances were during the Cairo conflict in 2558, with these destroyers on both sides of the fight, even paired with Varric pattern heavy cruisers in the fleet of the Jiralhani leader Hecabe. With that solid Covenant build and those dedicated reactors for those weapons, this was just a ship that every faction wanted to make sure they kept their hands on, and it remained deadly for decades even after the Covenant fell. That's it for the breakdown. Please hit that like button, check out the store link down below, but most important of all, remember, you know you're a deadly ship when the prophets are a little bit embarrassed about how powerful you are. May the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. And check out the store linked under the video. Tons of cool stuff there, and anything you pick up helps keep this thing running. But let's get into it. The Mutan Et pattern Stormcutter, known under the UNSC 3-letter classification as the DAS class Stormcutter, was one of the Covenant Navy's smallest dedicated warships, but it filled a highly important niche within the Covenant fleet doctrine. Manufactured by the primary assembly forges, it entered service during the 6th Age of Conflict, and the class is assigned as a fast attack vessel specializing in pursuit operations, in reconnaissance, fleet screening, and just the general harassment of enemy forces. Although far smaller than the famous Covenant capital ships like the Ket or Varric, its speed and agility is really what made it stand out. It also is one of the most independent ships out there, in terms of how long it can go without any contact with any other support system. Part of that deep recon aspect. Commanders looked at these ships as sort of relentless hunters capable of tracking, shadowing, and even making crucial precision strikes in roles that larger warships just couldn't fulfill. Almost like a ship in an assassin role. Now, I've mentioned this in some other videos, but the class distinctions is actually a broad term that lumps together multiple Covenant patterns. And so with things like the CAS, although that usually just evokes a single type of ship, there are technically other versions all under the CAS class. It's the same here, but we actually know of one of the other pattern examples, the Chel Tor pattern, though they're all called Stormcutters. That Chel Tor pattern was used later by the Order of Restoration, that fanatical sect of San Shayum that formed after the fall of the Covenant. It measured 225 meters or 740 feet long, and with a mass of 41,000 metric tons, putting it into a size category comparable to some of the smaller warships operated by the UNSC, similar to the Gladius-class heavy corvette and the stealth-focused Sahara-class heavy prowler. But just because it was a similar size to the human ships, it benefited from all the Covenant tech advantages, particularly in propulsion, sensor tech, and of course the nano-laminate hull armor and energy shielding. And we can't take for granted the superior energy weapons that just burn through armor plating. Like most Covenant warships, it was powered by a pinch fusion reactor. This masterful system that powers everything on the ship, from the propulsions to the shields and the weapons, really helps simplify logistics to not have all these different calibers of weapons and munitions. For normal space, it has repulsor engines, and for faster than light travel, it has that borer pattern slipspace drive, superior in every way to human FTL drives. And while it could be used in these long-range scouting missions or for surgical strikes on key assets, they were also deployed on the outskirts of battle formations, where they could provide early detection of enemy movements, more accurately pinpoint vulnerable targets, and then close in on these targets with rapid strikes. Imagine all the thousands of things you're trying to keep track of during a large fleet engagement, and you have this thing, like I said, like an assassin or some sniper, that's striking at that one key component, maybe a specialized ship in your fleet, or some specialized equipment on your flagship, and the Mutan Et just efficiently strikes at that alone. You can imagine how effective that would be and just how devastating it would be for human morale. This ship also had a sophisticated hyperscanner detector, one of the most advanced sensor suites used throughout the Human Covenant War, and it's all part of this idea of gathering as much intelligence as possible, as quickly as possible, and then getting that out to the rest of the fleet. Its primary armament was 4 Emery-Ka pattern light plasma lances. While not as devastating as the heavy plasma lances mounted aboard Covenant battlecruisers or assault carriers, these were usually still more than enough to just melt away 6 feet thick titanium A battleplate armor. Supporting those were 4 Eternos pattern plasma beam emitters, said to be incredibly precise, effective against both starships and even smaller targets, likely missiles and boarding craft, and it had 4 Fought-Et pattern pulse lasers, rapid-fire energy weapons commonly employed for point defense and anti-fighter duties. This specialized aspect purpose-made to take out missiles, strike craft, and those boarding craft, providing a defensive bubble. Again, you're not seeing an overwhelming amount of firepower here, just a bit on defense, which when combined with the shields and then the armor itself, is usually more than enough, and those beam weapons that could take out any human craft if deployed precisely. And the whole thing was only operated by a single superior, supported by 15 menials, responsible for engineering, navigation, maintenance, and all the other routine functions, with that superior playing the role of your naval officer. And they had a very small military complement of 1 obedientary and 10 warriors. Really, this is just to have an option for boarding capabilities. You never know when that might pop up during a battle. But also for counter-piracy, as the ship is small enough that it would be a prize for any pirate fleet, being an issue before the Human Covenant War, and of course even more of a target during the war. Imagine if humanity could have got their hands on one of these. And on top of everything, it had active jammers, deception field generators, which we've seen in a few other ships. It's not invisibility or cloaking, but it can make false positives on enemy systems. An insanely high-tech version of just saying, "What's that over there?" and then running the other direction. And automated repair systems. It's part of why it could work with such a small crew. So you got electronic warfare systems that could interfere with enemy targeting systems, screwing with missile guidance, and if anything did get through, you got weapons on defense that should be shooting things down, and then even if somehow something did get through, past the shields and the armor, that auto repair system should take care of it, being able to seal damages and prevent loss of air, and even restore the nanolaminate armor. Now, as for its history, during the war, they were assigned to hunter-killer duties, usually not parts of major fleets, though like I said, they could be, being that utterly annoying element knocking out crucial systems. But mostly they were acting as forward reconnaissance elements and strike craft, taking out unsuspecting enemy targets. One of the known vessels was Henry's Sorrow, which gained notoriety for repeatedly harassing UNSC supply lines and UEG trade routes. It's a great look at a detail of the war that's often overlooked, how a much smaller and overlooked ship like this could just create all sorts of problems when striking key assets, creating logistical nightmares. After the collapse of the Covenant during the Great Schism, and the Empire's dissolution by December 2552, all these specialized high-tech craft were now in the hands of all sorts of factions. With their modest crew requirements, that strong armament, and tech that meant that it could survive and escape almost any engagement, it really was a perfect ship for warlords and mercenary fleets, and just really took off with the Kigyar. For whatever reason, they seemed to have the greatest share of the Mouton et al. We know some more of the ships by name, like Divine Breath and Mark of Prophecy, which were both operated by Kigyar pirates and took part in smuggling and piracy operations all around the human colony world of New Carthage by 2554. And these 2 stormcutters would be involved in an engagement against the Gladius-class heavy corvette, the UNSC Sagan Blue. So years after there wasn't even a Covenant, there were still these ships that were just harassing human shipping lanes. So that's it for its breakdown, but I hope you see why this is such an interesting little ship. I really hope we do get to see more of it in future media. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. Check out the store down below, I'm sure you'll find something cool. But most important of all, remember, the best way to win a battle is to end it before your enemy even knew it started. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store. But let's get into it. The Hekar Ta pattern blockade runner, which does not have one of those 3-letter designations from the UNSC, This is one of the oldest surviving classes of Sangheili warships that still operate in the modern era, in the post-war era. The UNSC dubs it a corvette, while the Sangheili call it a vestige vessel, and it dates back to the ancient War of Beginnings, thousands of years before the formation of the Covenant. Built by the vassal workshops of Clan Makan and Clan Vol, these ships were originally developed as dedicated breakthrough and raiding vessels for Sangheili fleets in their fight against the Sanshayum. The longevity of this ship is something that we also saw with the Covenant, as things can be hundreds or even thousands of years old. Obviously, the Forerunner ships can be far older, but once you get a good spaceship design, it seems to last a very long time. So some of these last so long that they range from before the Sangheili joined the Covenant all the way up through use in Jul 'Madama's Covenant in the post-war era. Jul 'Madama being a Sangheili that was trying to keep the Covenant alive after the death of the prophets. The ship itself reflects Sangheili naval doctrine philosophy, focusing on speed, aggression, and offensive striking power, which are valued far above defense. A true focus on this blockade running role, where it's supposed to smash through enemy lines, pursue any damaged ships, killing or capturing these stragglers, and exploiting any weaknesses they saw in enemy formations. At 2,020 meters, or 1.25 miles long, and with a weight of 80 million metric tons, it is an unusually large ship for something classified as a corvette. The Xanar pattern light cruiser was only 300 meters long, so this is almost 7 times that. Even the SDV class heavy corvette was only around 956 meters long. In fact, it's about as long as a CCS plus a Xanar. And it gets closer to things like some Covenant frigates, like the Esther pattern, though it lacks a lot of the armor and shielding strength that was characteristic of later Covenant capital ships. Just looking at it, you see how it reflects the Sangheili tradition of biomimetic warship design. Ships that look like living creatures. This one is specifically evoking the Archon Ta, a predatory fish native to the northern waters of Sanghelios, and was moved to several Sangheili colony worlds. We saw the same sort of thing with the Banshee, and you even got it with the latest Phantom. The result is this sleek, predatory silhouette that visually differs from many Covenant-era ships, which were more incorporating Sanshayum designs. And we have details that make direct comparisons to the Ket pattern battlecruiser, the CCS, saying that that ship was stronger, both the armor plating was stronger, but also its shielding, and the Ket also had to be more powerful, but they stressed that the Hekar Ta is sacrificing armor in exchange for greater speed. So the whole idea is that this thing could be zipping around the battlefield, not intended to be in a straight-up fight, slugging it out in some capital ship battle, even though it is larger than many of the capital ships. I mean, far larger than almost every human ship, but even bigger than the Ket, though it's moving around quicker, but is actually easier to destroy. And it does have a surprisingly large complement, with the standard crew consisting of 5 superiors, 220 menials, with a complement of 15 obedientaries, 100 warriors, and 500 thralls. This is a larger complement than many Covenant ships of a comparable size, and it really does reflect its original role. If some Sangheili asset was blockaded, maybe some civil war or just some large pirate faction, the ship was supposed to race through those defenses and then could put 600 plus boots on the ground, take out some key asset or rescue some people, whatever the mission called for. But also there's an important detail that's implied but not explicitly said, but it had to have some equivalent of Tick boarding craft or phantom dropships, something like that, because they stressed that it was used for boarding actions. You would have this ship zipping around a fleet, likely firing off ticks or releasing phantoms, 50 Sangheili here, 50 Sangheili there, all turning a fleet engagement into a shootout in the corridors of the enemy ship. And all of that is in line with ancient Sangheili doctrine emphasizing direct combat and personal valor. You know which one would be more glorious, to be a Sangheili sitting in a captain's chair pressing buttons, or personally slicing through some pirate captain with your energy sword. And of course, though I keep stressing that it was weak on defense, good luck trying to capture this ship. Like I keep saying, there's a lot of implied piracy issues with the ancient Sangheili, which also kind of fits if they're also warlike. They would have had countless factions that pop up, all wanting their own personal glory, all rejecting some overlord. And so we're also told that this huge complement is so that this ship can't be taken. Though of course, this highly honor-bound species would eventually lose that War of Beginnings and be absorbed into the Sanshayum-run Covenant. And when this happened, the Hekar-Ta was now deployed with multiple client species on board. And so a ship that was originally designed for Sangheili had to have all sorts of modifications to support all these aliens like Ungoi and Kigyar. But even the Sangheili themselves found these ancient vessels to be uncomfortable, retaining features from 2 millennia earlier. With 2 of the strangest details we get is that they had scented atmospheric systems and the continuous playing of subsonic hymnals. What I think they're going for there is picture a modern being placed in some ancient church that might be constantly filled with the sounds of prayers and the smell of incense. Like most alien ships, propulsion is provided by repulsor engines, and it has a slipspace drive, though all of those represent an older generation of Sangheili tech. Though you gotta think at least the slipspace drive would have been updated with a newer Covenant version, unless it was close enough to keep up with its fellow ships in some fleet. Interestingly, it also had advanced hyperscanner systems, which even these, on this ancient Sangheili ship, were more advanced than the human sensor suites. But they are outperformed by the Covenant-era purpose-made reconnaissance ships and stealth ships. But it also has an ancient MESA stealth generator system, which just conceals the ship through brute force jamming methods and even swarms of expendable drones. These are brute force because they're not doing anything sophisticated. They're not making yourself invisible to an enemy sensor. They're just flooding it like white noise. So in a way, the enemy knew that there was some issue, some threat. They just would have no clue what it was or where it was. And its armament was still respected, even though it was thousands of years old. Its primary weapon being a single Ferex pattern excavation beam. I find that one a bit odd, as the whole point of the excavation beams is that it was part of the Covenant religion. Called an excavation beam because it was originally an archaeological tool. It was supposed to remove debris so that they could get to ancient Forerunner sites. So why would the Sangheili have the exact same type of weapon independently? You gotta think that that was a Covenant-era addition. So maybe what it originally had were the 3 Corvin pattern plasma beam emitters, because we are told that Covenant bureaucrats would criticize these older energy projector systems, seeing them as crude and unrefined. But the actual captains of these ships, and the commanders of entire fleets, all thought that they were more than adequate, perfectly capable of melting away any enemy ship they came across, just like your standard modern Covenant system. They also had 24 GAF Neuron pattern plasma cannons, 16 Litrex pattern plasma torpedo silos, and 10 Eru pattern pulse lasers. An armament that at least keeps up with, but in many cases it exceeds what we see on a lot of Covenant cruisers, with the plasma cannons providing sustained anti-ship bombardment, the pulse lasers serving as point defense weapons against fighters and missiles and any incoming boarding craft, anyone crazy enough to want to scrap with Sangheili on their home turf. And a really cool detail about the plasma torpedo launchers is that unlike most Covenant ships, where the torpedoes are mostly just fired forward, the blockade runners' torpedo silos are designed to launch many of their weapons rearward, out the back of the ship, but this is because of its blockade running role. It would race past a bunch of ships, fire out of its back, and actually hit the enemy towards the rear, towards their crucial engine systems, which meant that they could either be mopped up by other forces, or were sitting ducks perfect to be boarded by that large complement. We are told though that because these ships are so unique, they did need specialized ship masters, but obviously if you knew what you were doing, these proved to be deadly throughout thousands of years, and were often paired with more recent escorts like the Acton pattern, combining this ancient ship's raw striking power with the protection and support capabilities of these newer ships. And the last thing to mention about the breakdown is that at the center, you have this hangar bay, which we are only told it had some models of ancient Banshees, along with other long obsolete Sangheili aerospace craft, and those must have been the ones used for boarding. One of the most famous named ships was Jory's Light, which almost kept the Sangheili out of the Covenant, repeatedly avoiding destruction and capture, but eventually with the signing of the Writ of Union and creation of the Covenant, the species would be conquered, but Jory's Light famously refused to join the new alliance, and instead vanished into unexplored space, establishing a whole branch of Sangheili that were independent, maintaining their honor because of how great this ship was. While many surviving blockade runners trace their lineage to fleets commanded by Ofan Koram, whose forces relied heavily upon this line of ship, and over centuries all sorts of examples were found hidden away in reserve fleets or in forgotten stockpiles. and during the post-war blooding years, both the Swords of Sanghelios and Jul 'Mdama's Covenant recovered these ancient ships, often from caches in the Jori system. And there's this really amazing arms race where two different Sangheli factions are in an arms race against each other, trying to upgrade these ancient ships in a system that was named after the most famous of the Hekar-Ta. And it is these ships that would fight in the Battle of Kamchatka, the Assault on Argent Moon, the Battle of Sunayon, and later over Subon, where you see these fleets composed largely of blockade runners and Xanar pattern light cruisers, battling banished forces with their Carves and Dreadnought. So that's it for its breakdown. I hope you see why this is such an interesting and overlooked ship. Please hit that like button, I could really use your support. And check out the store, there's all sorts of cool stuff from different fandoms. But most important of all, remember, if it ain't broke, just give it an excavation beam, but don't change anything else. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store link down below. But let's get into it. The Kiwu pattern battleship is one of the most unusual, of the largest, and one of the more rare but still formidable warships ever used by the Covenant. Introduced in the 9th Age of Reclamation and commissioned by the Ministry of Concert, this ship would break with many of the traditional doctrines that govern Covenant naval architecture. Most were primarily designed for planetary subjugation and fleet command, which just grew out of a sort of religious crusade effect as they searched the galaxy for Forerunner artifacts. The Kiwu pattern was actually designed to destroy other Covenant warships. This very mission role is why it's so rare. Its existence points to an issue with the Covenant, that it wasn't as harmonious as the leaders would have you think. And so one of the more secretive ships ever designed ultimately received the blessing from the Hierarchs, which is described as an unusually irregular approval process. The Ministry of Concert, whose very name evokes the conductor, a sort of heavenly orchestra, the sounds of the spheres. This idea that the Sanshayum leadership was in charge of maintaining a harmony. That's why it's called the Ministry of Concert. Each member of the orchestra specialized in some instrument and were supposed to all play together. And so it was this ministry that was responsible for the control and subjugation of the Covenant's lower caste species. I've mentioned in a ton of other Covenant ship breakdowns that no matter how specialized the ship is, it might be some stealth craft, and yet they still make sure they have a contingent of warriors inside. There's always this fear of piracy, and the idea that one of these powerful Covenant ships could fall into enemy hands. And classified as a battleship, it would serve as both a fleet flagship, but of course a dedicated ship-to-ship artillery platform. And at 3,500 meters, over 2 miles long, it is among the largest of Covenant combat ships. The ubiquitous Ket pattern, the CCS, was around half its length, while even the ORS, the Varric pattern heavy cruiser, was only 2.7 kilometers long. And it was almost 3 times the length of a Marathon-class heavy cruiser. With a mass of 500 million tons, that's almost 3x your normal Covenant cruiser, so you can see it's firmly in the category of super heavy capital warships. Like almost all Covenant ships, it was powered by massive pinch fusion reactors, this one energy system that provides everything for propulsion, weapon systems, and the defensive shielding. For normal space, you have repulsor engines, and it has those slipspace drives, allowing you to cross the galaxy at faster than light speeds, while the hull is made of nanolaminate plating. And then that too is protected by the powerful energy shield systems, which is said to be on par with those used in the largest of Covenant warships, things like the Carol, the CAS. And these shields are known to take multiple nuke hits or max strikes before they would fail. Because this ship was designed to fight other Covenant ships, it was said to be unusually strong on defense. And we get exact numbers that it could take 3 direct MAC rounds and hundreds of M58 Archer missile pods before those shields would start to be overwhelmed. Even then, the nanolaminate armor seems to be specialized or just extra thick, as we're told that dozens of Archer missiles striking the unshielded hull would only cause very minor structural damage. And as this was intended to crush any rebellions, to bring about harmony, as the leadership would put it, it has incredible offensive capabilities. Its primary weapon was a single Muish pattern flensing lance turret mounted dorsally along the ship's upper hull. This is said to be one of, if not the most powerful ship-killing systems deployed by the Covenant during the war. Unlike plasma torpedoes or plasma lances, this flensing lance was designed specifically for long-range engagements against heavily shielded capital ships. Let's say some breakaway faction took some CCS, some Ket battlecruisers. Well, the whole idea here is that they could strike targets far beyond the effective range of other Covenant capital ships, really making it function like a form of strategic artillery. And you can imagine these would be used with the Mouton Et covered in the last video. That little assassin-type ship that could stealthily get in and out of engagements, sending it out for recon, and having this artillery piece deliver that killing shot. To support that main weapon were 10 Luxor pattern heavy plasma beam arrays. These are similar to your normal plasma beam emitters, things we see on all the heavy cruisers and assault carriers. And to complement those are 55 Font-Et pattern pulse laser turrets, which serve the role of point defense, anti-fighter protection, missile interception, and to engage smaller boarding craft. It's kind of a funny thought, but imagine some ballsy faction, the most brazen of pirates, that when hunted down in their stolen capital ship, they just send out another boarding party to try and capture the Kiwu. Well, 55 Font-Et pattern pulse laser turrets were there to make sure that didn't happen. Now, as for its history, the only real details we get are all tied to the fall of Reach. On August 30, 2552, a Kiwu would take part in the massive orbital engagement above Reach, and during that battle, it used that range advantage to stay outside the effective firing envelope of Reach's powerful Erode-class orbital defense platforms. From its position, it systematically targeted and destroyed countless UNSC warships, including the Musashi, Minotaur, and Herodotus. Most tiny Covenant ships were strong enough to take out the largest of human ships, so you can imagine how devastating the Kiwu was. An enormous Covenant ship designed to take out other Covenant ships. Eventually, the battleship attracted the attention of the UNSC Pillar of Autumn, commanded by Captain Jacob Keyes. The Halcyon-class cruiser engaged the vastly larger Covenant ship, trying to make use of its upgraded magnetic accelerator cannon. During the battle, it fired 3 Mach rounds and launched more than 500 Archer missiles, and this is what eventually overwhelmed the battleship's energy shields. But even then, like mentioned before, those Archer missiles only inflicted minimal damage to the underlying hull. And so Keyes came up with the idea to remotely pilot a GATL-1 longsword interceptor carrying a Shiva-class nuclear missile, piloting it directly toward the battleship during the brief interval when the energy shields were regenerating. And that nuke detonated just as the shields came back online. Rather than dispersing the blast, the reactivated shield envelope trapped and contained the explosion, just amplifying that destructive blast. The resulting feedback catastrophically destroyed the Kiwu pattern, eliminating one of the most dangerous Covenant warships at Reach, and really standing as one of the greatest examples of how human ingenuity would be what helped us win this war. The minds of people like Keyes that were better than any Covenant tech. And although there aren't many other details about this ship, it is a fascinating glimpse at the internal conflicts within the Covenant Empire even before humanity showed up. That's it for its breakdown. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. Check out the store link down below. Tons of cool stuff from all sorts of fandoms. But most important of all, remember, if a rebel faction steals the ship that you made to destroy the other ships they stole, you can always just build another bigger ship. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, it really does help. And check out the store link down below. Let's break down the Rassus Pattern Interdictor, often just called by the UNSC the Covenant Battleship or Covenant Super Destroyer. It really is one of the strongest warships ever fielded by the Covenant during the Human-Covenant War. Being introduced in the 23rd Age of Doubt, and stretching 2,000 meters or 6,600 feet long and 1,330 feet wide, with a mass of 90 million tons, it's a bit larger than most of the frontline capital warships. 200 meters longer than the ubiquitous Ket, and greater than the Eastern Pattern Armored Frigate or the Ceudar Pattern Heavy Corvette. But of course nowhere near the Siphon, the Carol, or the enormous Shawada. Its build is pretty typical, with repulsor engines, that superior Covenant slipspace drive, protected by nano-laminate armor, and then energy shielding. But it obviously is one of the strangest looking ships ever, with these 5 large bulbous sections, that swollen prow, paired lateral lobes, and this huge dorsal structure, and that extended stern. Unlike most Covenant warships, which all kinda look the same, obviously this is a silhouette unlike anything else out there. And that's because it was built around an extraordinarily rare connection of ancient Foreigner weapon cores. Covenant records indicate that these relic systems were incorporated directly into the vessel's structure, making each ship effectively irreplaceable. They're not pumped out by some assembly forge, and so they were also never produced in large numbers. The destruction of a Rassus pattern meant the permanent loss of irreplaceable Forerunner tech, and this rarity explains why the Covenant regarded these ships with religious reverence. These were holy relics that powered this war vessel. And it is interesting that even the term interdictor is theorized to have been picked up from the ancient Forerunner naval terminology. And so even in its title and how it was used, this could be a sacred Covenant continuation of the Forerunner's ecumene. The ecumene is what we call the Forerunner Empire, all the places that they inhabited, which existed over 100,000 years ago and had permanent residence on 3 million different worlds. And so you can imagine the selection process for who gets to crew this ship. The Rassus pattern is less a conventional battleship than a mobile sacred shrine. You might remember that those 3-letter designations used by Oni, things like CCS or ORS, we only know what O and S mean. O is for ordained, meaning that it uses Forerunner tech, as in it's been ordained or blessed by the Holy Ones, and S is for salvation, but that just means because you were burning the galaxy with holy fire, cleansing the galaxy of evil every time you took out an enemy to the Covenant. So if being a crew member of the ORS was highly prized, the reward of a lifetime of commitment, and proving yourself exceptionally in battle, I can't imagine what it took to crew a Rassus, a one-of-one holy relic war machine. And as you'd expect, it's ranked among the most heavily armed vessels in the entire Covenant fleet. Its primary battery consisted of 12 worthy fire pattern relic lances, ancient Forerunner-derived weapons whose destructive power far exceeded that of normal plasma lances that you'll see coming standard across Covenant cruisers and battle cruisers. Supporting these were 10 Luxor pattern heavy plasma beam emitters. These are standard Covenant tech, and more than capable enough to melt through 6 feet thick sections of titanium A-plate armor, the standard armor of UNSC ships, boiling that away in seconds. And it also had 24 Malusian pattern heavy plasma cannons for providing sustained bombardment capability against both fleets and planetary targets, and 4 J8 pattern plasma torpedo silos, whose guided plasma warheads gave it crucial lock-on abilities, not just line-of-sight firing. These could actually follow ships as they turned and even go around obstacles. And having so much weaponry meant that a single Rassus pattern could engage multiple enemy formations all at the same time. And while the Ket pattern, or even the Varric pattern heavy cruiser, would be the centerpiece of a Covenant battle group, a Rassus pattern often was the battle group. Just by itself, it had enough power to threaten an entire UNSC task force. Human naval analysts regarded it as one of the few Covenant warships that were capable of annihilating dozens of enemy ships in a single engagement. And its 124 Rescook pattern pulse laser turrets all formed a point defense network capable of intercepting everything from fighters, attack craft, and incoming missiles. And as you'd expect for such a priceless craft, these are amongst the greatest countermeasures we see on any Covenant ship. Hopefully intercepting anything before it could hit the shields, and then of course that shield was very powerful. All Covenant ships would need multiple MAC rounds or direct nuclear strikes to take it down, and then the nanolaminate armor plating itself, well, there's countless examples of those just eating dozens of Archer missiles. Though of course, like every other Covenant ship, they had to go up against human ingenuity, which did often prove superior, and humanity learned that they just had to direct multiple ships at one Covenant vessel at a time, and eventually those shields would come down. One of the most famous named ships of this class was Heaven's Brilliant Beer, B-I-E-R, not as in beer the drink, but as beer the stand for a coffin. But this ship's appearance at Harvest gave humanity one of its deadliest encounters with the true scale of Covenant naval power. In July of 2525, during the Colonial Military Authority's investigation of Harvest, this ship met Battle Group 4, and the encounter was catastrophic for the CMA. Within just a minute of combat, the frigates Arabia and Vostok were destroyed, while the destroyer Heracles suffered so much damage that it had to withdraw. Imagine the first ship you meet with this strange alien enemy is the Rassus pattern. And then during the second Battle of Harvest in March of 2526, it faced the growing forces of Vice Admiral Preston Cole. But even against a substantially larger UNSC formation, it destroyed 13 ships from Cole's battle group, inflicting losses that would have been remarkable for an entire Covenant fleet. It was only because of Cole's order telling 27 different ships to coordinate their fire at one time that the Rassus was finally overwhelmed and destroyed. These interactions set the standard for most of the Human Covenant War, and that a single Covenant ship could just melt away several of humanity's best vessels, and that our only hope was just these coordinated strikes. A tactic which would express itself in a ton of different ways, but every interaction was basically shaped by these two truths. And then several of them would take part in the fall of Reach as members of the Fleet of Particular Justice, that massive Covenant armada commanded by Supreme Commander Thel 'Vadamee, who would later become the Arbiter. Their presence was with hundreds of other Covenant warships, as Reach really was humanity's second most important world, behind only Earth, and that's reflected in just how many assets the Covenant threw at Reach. Now, later in that same year, there were several new interdictors assembled within the High Prophet of Truth's secret armada at Unyielding Hierophant, a fleet that was composed of hundreds of warships ranging from battlecruisers to assault carriers and battleship, intended to launch a surprise invasion of Earth, part of Truth's own plan, not shared with the other hierarchs. But before that operation could begin, a team of Spartan 2s infiltrated and sabotaged this massive refit station. This attack obliterated Unyielding Hierophant, and virtually the entire fleet gathered around it, including those priceless Rassus pattern interdictors. So although very rare, and depicted quite goofily for just how incredible the lore is on this thing, like always, special shout out to everybody that works on the Sins of the Prophets, that truly priceless mod for the Halo community, because if not, this video would have just been 3 pictures of that odd bubble boy. If you made it this far, please hit that like button, check out the store link down below, but most important of all, remember, if you ever find ancient alien tech, weaponize it and build a cult around it, and may the domain preserve you, always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This breakdown will pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. And check out my store linked under the video. There's tons of cool stuff there from all sorts of fandoms. It's fun to just window shop, but anything you buy there helps to keep this thing running. Let's get into it. The Varric pattern heavy cruiser, designated by the UNSC as the ORS class heavy cruiser, really did occupy a unique position within the Covenant Navy. Instead of serving solely as a frontline combat vessel, like the more common CCS class battlecruiser or CRS class light cruiser, the ORS was designed to fulfill several strategic roles simultaneously, functioning as a command ship, planetary occupation platform, even a reconnaissance vessel, and heavy warship capable of supporting the largest of Covenant formations. In a lot of respects, it bridges a gap between the conventional cruisers and massive assault carriers that often served as fleet flagships. Its combination of command and control facilities, extensive troop accommodations, the excavation capabilities via that enormous beam, and the overwhelming firepower made it one of the most versatile capital ships available to the Covenant. And so the ORS was one of the most coveted ships to command, and they would often be entrusted with missions that could determine the fate of entire worlds and entire solar systems, changing the fate of entire species, sometimes just in their effort to recover some sacred Forerunner relics. Or they could be the hub of operations controlling things across a galactic arm. The first letter O for ordained identifies the vessel as having been enhanced through the incorporation of Forerunner tech. In this case, it's referring specifically to its powerful Shrine Core weapon system and energy infrastructure, as these relic technologies elevated the ship beyond the capabilities of ordinary Covenant cruisers. This was not just a slight tech boon, the distinction was significant, as relatively few Covenant vessels possessed such a direct integration of ancient Forerunner systems. Even many larger ships, like the assault carriers, are really just running on Covenant engineering. It's why they don't have an O in their name, and the only other one I'm aware of is the CSO, the Shawada pattern, that ship that was nearly 29 kilometers long, or 18 miles, and it too was enhanced with Forerunner tech. So that's just 2 ships, really stressing how unique this is. The second letter R for reverence shows that unlike most Covenant warships, whose primary focus was just military operations, the Varric pattern was built to support archaeological and reconnaissance missions tied to the Covenant religion. Remember, this really is a holistic worldview. Everything from the tech to the purpose of the Covenant is downstream of their worldview, of their interpretation of the Forerunners. It's a religious government and military. And so that glassing beam that would strike fear into the entirety of humanity as it destroyed entire worlds, that is actually just an archaeological tool being applied in a military way. And the ORS is using extensive sensor arrays and Forerunner excavation systems via that dedicated excavation beam in order to uncover and secure more ancient Forerunner sites. They've incorporated some Forerunner tech into this vessel so that it can better find more Forerunner tech. It's this snowballing of ancient alien devices that made the Covenant by far the most powerful force in our galaxy. This capability made the class particularly valuable to the ministries responsible for exploration and artifact recovery. And leadership saw the ORS as a mobile temple/fortress. It was all in this effort to support and facilitate the Covenant's sacred Great Journey. The final letter S stands for salvation, and that does just essentially mean war. Like the CCS in many other Covenant ships, whose primary focus was just for warfare, that S is this aspect of the Covenant view of salvation. They're saving souls by dominating them and incorporating them into the Covenant. Of course, humanity wasn't even offered this, because the higher-ups realized that humans were the Forerunners, and that would kinda upend their entire system. They weren't ready to hand over humanity those fancy hats, or give us the keys to their hover thrones. And so the ORS is the ordained reverence and salvation vessel, Forerunner integrated, to find more Forerunner sites, and strong enough to oppose anybody who stood in the way of the Great Journey, or bring their species on board. But because of the primacy of its reconnaissance and relic recovery mission profile, Covenant personnel often refer to this just as the Reverence class. Remember, the ORS is a human designation coming from Oni, and so while the Covenant name for it is the Varric, sometimes they too just called it the Reverence. This was that ship that was always on religious missions, locating sacred sites throughout the galaxy. Whereas the CCS class battlecruiser became synonymous with the Covenant's military might. Like mentioned in that breakdown, even the lowliest of cadets could identify a CCS just by its shape. It was iconic of the Covenant, and the CAS class assault carrier was that great behemoth that imposed terror. The Varric really does play this unique role. Following the collapse of the Covenant during the Great Schism, surviving ORS class heavy cruisers became some of the most coveted warships in the fragmented post-war era. And the fact that they were so rare, had this immense combat capability, and yet this symbolic connection to the Covenant's ancient past made them one of the most prized possessions among Sangheili keeps, and were a constant source of backstabbing and warfare amongst Covenant remnant factions and just independent warlords. Because it integrated Forerunner tech, although that might sound more complicated and thus more difficult to maintain, I'd speculate that since they did pull this integration off, it might have required almost no maintenance, because think about how ancient the Forerunner sites are that they are working with. These things could remain dormant for hundreds of thousands of years and still work just fine. As for its size, it was 3,000 meters, or 1.86 miles long, and 1,450 meters, or 0.9 miles across, which makes it by far the largest known Covenant cruiser class, dwarfing things like the 300-meter CRS class, the iconic CCS at 1,782 meters, and even the larger and older 2,700-meter Malgan pattern. In its enormous mass of around 200 million tons, it was more than twice that of the Ket pattern, but still less than a tenth of the Carol. Unlike many later Covenant warships that relied heavily on automation and had relatively small crews, the Varric was actually notoriously labor-intensive. Most crew numbers for Covenant ships don't get above 50. This vessel had around 1,286 permanent crew members, with 16 Sangheili superiors, 70 Huragok engineers, and around 1,200 Ungoi and other menial personnel. This data point seems to reflect the ancient origins of this design, just how old this thing was, as the ship's system's architecture dates back to the Covenant's earliest centuries. Like in the Malgan breakdown I said how it helped build the Covenant, it seems that that's even more true for the Varric. And being so old meant that it forced operators to rely on specialists capable of interpreting archaic Sangheili interfaces and tons of different cryptic control systems. That means that this ship is so old that the language of the Sangheili has changed so much over the centuries, probably over the millennia, that your average Sangheili actually couldn't read the control systems. Kind of think of it with ancient Greek. The Koine Greek, with Koine meaning common, so the common Greek of the time of the New Testament, it's said that most modern Greek speakers would have a pretty good grasp of the Koine Greek, but it's said that Homeric Greek would basically be unintelligible to a modern Greek reader, even though they're both considered Greek. Or like the case with Old English versus current English. This is Beowulf in Old English. Apparently the Varic had systems that were something like this, where the average Sangheili would have no clue what this is saying. And so your sort of Venn diagram of who can actually run this ship is pretty small. They're both great ship engineers and can read this ancient script. But looking at its military complement, it carried around 400 obedientaries, 6,000 warriors, and 8,500 thralls. Obedientaries is probably those higher-ranking warriors, and the thralls were likely mostly Ungoi. This troop capacity rivaled that of some Covenant carriers, and made the ORS exceptionally well-suited for planetary occupations and large-scale ground campaigns. And then powering the cruiser was that unusual combination of Covenant and Forerunner tech. While most Covenant capital ships relied primarily on massive pinch fusion reactors, this is one of the few cases where it does not have this. Instead, it's powered by the mysterious Forerunner Shrine Core power plants, whose full capabilities remained poorly understood even by the Covenant. The cores themselves were considered sacred relics, and were restrained by elaborate devotional seals and safety interlocks. Again, these religious artifacts are practical in a sense that we're not really used to. They are pieces of technology, but imbued with this holiness. And when you add that ancient language aspect to this, you could imagine that each ship developed its own sort of priestly cults around it. One could be an expert in some other Forerunner tech, and yet have no idea what's going on inside of Varic. The Huragok technicians are said to have performed ritualized procedures to access their powers, and improper use could potentially destroy the entire vessel, which of course would have been seen as divine judgment by the Forerunners. They were literally and metaphysically deemed unworthy of using this thing. But this great power source channels the propulsion provided by 3 large repulsor engines, while a borer pattern slipspace drive is what allows the cruiser to construct deep reconnaissance missions across the Orion Arm, and rapidly deploy across the galaxy. Its most powerful ship-to-ship weapon was a single Ventrax pattern heavy plasma lance mounted along the dorsal surface. And like the energy projectors mounted on larger Covenant warships like the CAS-class assault carrier or CSO-class supercarrier, the lance fired a concentrated stream of plasma at nearly light speed. It's weapons like these that we see slicing through warships with this overwhelming combination of thermal and kinetic force. And then supplementing that were 3 Philo pattern plasma beam emitters, though it's really odd that the cruiser could only fire one of these powerful beams at a time. It's incredibly strong, but even with the Forerunner integration, it still had its limits. Then its more conventional weaponry were the 48 Melusian pattern heavy plasma cannons and 16 core pattern plasma torpedo silos, which formed the core of its offensive battery. The heavy plasma cannons delivered devastating direct fire attacks, while the guided plasma torpedoes allowed the ship to engage targets that were trying to escape, tracking moving targets. The ubiquitous CCS class carried fewer heavy weapons, but relied more heavily on its energy projector for decisive strikes. The ORS combined the devastating punch of larger Covenant warships with the sustained firepower expected of a major cruiser, while defensive coverage was provided by 80 Ferial pattern pulse lasers, creating a dense anti-fighter and anti-missile screen, which is pretty standard among a lot of Covenant carriers. This made it particularly resistant to fighter swarms and missile barrages that were favored by the UNSC Navy, as this was humanity's only hope at getting through the Covenant shielding. Just a sheer volume of kinetic impacts. But then we of course have what humanity would call its glassing function. Mounted within the vessel was the far pattern super heavy excavation beam, meant for excavating Forerunner relic sites, turned into the source of those planetary glassing operations. But even this also has 16 FET pattern plasma bombardment mortars designed for precise orbital strikes. These mortars allowed the cruiser to engage surface targets without resorting to full-scale glassing. Even on a ship this advanced, it does not have infinite energy, and as deadly as that single beam is, it is just a single beam. These mortars allowed it to hit multiple targets at one time, without the immense energy dump of that single beam. So I hope you see this really is a more specialized and sophisticated platform than many standard Covenant cruisers. And I gotta end by mentioning that it also had advanced stealth capabilities that are almost never seen on ships of this size. This type of cloaking system allowed it to mask its presence from enemy fleets despite its enormous dimensions. This is something we usually only see with Covenant ships like stealth corvettes or reconnaissance ships. But remember, this was a reconnaissance ship. Though once you wanted to get to glassing or sending off those mortars, you would of course give up that stealth aspect. But how terrifying is it that something with this much capability could just be lurking nearby completely undetected by your scanners? Truly, the Varric is one of the most underlooked and underappreciated of the Covenant ships. The first Varric entered service during the Third Age of Conflict, which is one of the Covenant's earliest and most turbulent eras, marked by endless civil wars, purges, which you would have to think means the destruction of entire species, and all sorts of bloodshed within existing Covenant members, backstabs, betrayals, that kind of thing, that define the Covenant's ages of conflict and doubt. As veterans of these formative struggles, the Varric warships came to embody ancient honor and prestige within the Covenant society. Their long histories of service and accumulated battlefield glory reflected not only the vessels themselves, but also the carefully selected crews that were entrusted to command them. Classified as Examiner-class ships, these heavy cruisers ranged across vast stretches of the Orion Arm. Because of the importance and prestige associated with them, only Covenant ministries that had received direct authorization from the hierarchs were permitted to activate, crew, and deploy these warships. And although never as numerous as more common Covenant capital ships, there were a limited number of Varric pattern heavy cruisers that participated in the Human Covenant War, usually serving as flagships for smaller battle groups. And this is likely why this ship is kind of overlooked and at least underappreciated. It never became infamous because it just didn't encounter humanity enough. People were way more terrified of the Ket because that was what was most likely to have killed your friends and family, and the most likely way that you would die. But during the Fall of Reach, there was a Varric that operated within the fleet of Valiant Prudence, commanding a task force that included several Ceudar pattern heavy corvettes and a single Ket battlecruiser. The outbreak of the Great Schism saw these revered warships drawn into the Covenant's final and most destructive civil war. And I think it should be noted that it's always stressed how ancient the Varric was, that it was there in some of the earliest and bloodiest moments in the formation of the Covenant. I think this points to the fact that the Covenant had been on the downhill for at least hundreds if not thousands of years. How else did they make a foreigner-infused ship that seems to be more advanced than their later creations? Some speculation, but it is interesting that they purged many other species during the making of the Covenant. Perhaps some group that was lost to history helped bring the Varric about, but they were on the losing side of these Covenant civil wars. So although the Great Schism would see the official end of the Covenant, perhaps it was on the decline for hundreds, if not thousands of years at that point. But the Varric would outlive the Covenant. One of the most notable was the heavy cruiser Incorruptible, which fell under the command of Varro Manticree. And during the Battle of Installation 05, the vessel briefly spearheaded efforts to unite the fractured Covenant fleets in an attempt to contain and quarantine the flood outbreak. The Incorruptible later led a substantial armada from the combined fleet of Righteous Purpose to the shield world Onyx, where that cruiser ultimately met its end. It is crazy to think that, like I mentioned, these were probably operating just fine in the hands of independent warlords, all those splinter factions that arose, but that monk-like order that could still read the ancient Sanghili script and actually understand how to operate this thing without releasing that divine justice that would rip the ship apart. You can just imagine how complex these worldviews would become, developing in isolation, a new priestly class within another version of the Covenant that might emerge, and then that they would fight each other, some crewed by Sanghili and others operated by Jiralhani, as at least some Varric pattern heavy cruisers were operated by these different factions, specifically seen during the Cairo conflict. So that's it for its breakdown. I hope you understand why this ship is just so unique, and if you made it this far, please hit that like button. I really do need your help. And check out the store. It's really fun to just look around, but anything you buy does help to keep the channel running. But most important of all, remember, if your tech is on the decline, so is your empire, and may the domain preserve you. Always.
Oh, hell.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This breakdown will pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button and check out the store linked under the video. Tons of cool stuff there. Anything you pick up helps to keep this thing running. But let's get into it. The RCS class armored cruiser, also known as the Malgun pattern, is one of the Covenant's oldest and most enduring cruiser designs. Entering service around the 5th Age of Reclamation, which sadly we can't correlate to any Earth timeline. It could be anywhere over the past 2,000 years, but it predates the famous CCS class Ket pattern. It's actually beating it out by 2 full ages of reclamation. The Ket came out by the 7th, but the Malgun served for centuries as the Covenant's primary armored cruiser. It's what helped build the Covenant, as this is a collection of different alien species. It's a Covenant empire, which includes more species than the most famous ones, like the Sanghili, Ungoi, or Kigyar. And then even after being eclipsed by newer vessels, it still remained in service throughout the Human-Covenant War, and saw renewed use among the Covenant splinter factions after the Great Schism, because it really was just built that well, living for centuries or maybe even millennia, so that we can get this amazing scene.
To help them along.
Now this was an enormous ship at 2,000 meters or 6,562 feet long, 1,000 meters wide, and nearly 3,000 meters tall. It dwarfed just about every UNSC warship out there, and was one of the largest cruisers ever fielded by the Covenant. One of the UNSC's largest ships, the Marathon-class heavy cruiser, was only 1,170 meters long, and even the great CCS-class battlecruiser was only 1,782 meters long. Only the enormous Varric pattern heavy cruiser exceeded the Malgun among the known Covenant cruiser class, while the largest overall is still the Shawata supercarrier, the CSO class, at 29 kilometers or 18 miles long. And with a mass of around 122 million tons, it had the bulk and durability expected of an older Covenant design, created before energy shielding became sufficiently advanced to replace heavy armor. It's kind of funny, if you watched all the videos on the UNSC ships, humanity never had shielding systems throughout the Human-Covenant War. They just relied on these thick plates of titanium A armor, often 6 feet thick panels of pure titanium. While the Malgun is so old that we're seeing something similar here with this Covenant ship. Its nano-laminate battle plate was supplemented with extensive external armor layers, so crisscrossed armor on top of armor, giving it a thicker and more heavily reinforced appearance, instead of the iconic honeycomb look of their armor, also reflected up into how their shielding is dispersed. Before this clean, sleek, hexagonal armor plating exterior, there is this more rugged look that we see with the Malgun. It has 4 primary hangars, 2 port and 2 starboard, and 2 fighter hangars, 1 port and 1 starboard, and we aren't told how many, but just numerous craft, said to have a large number of Seraph fighters, Phantoms, Spirits, and other support craft, and said to be broadly comparable to the CCS battlecruisers. Though since it's such a larger ship, you would expect those numbers to be higher, maybe around 2 times what we see with the CCS, but also it is an older design, so maybe it just wasn't as efficient. It does have the ventral gravity lift and excavation beam assembly, which enabled the cruiser to conduct planetary insertions, delivering teams for Forerunner artifact recovery operations, or for moving troops, ground vehicles, and other material down to the surface, just like what we saw with the CCS. But it is also this same device which functions as the excavation beam, so we see it serving this dual role. It's actually primarily as a sort of research vessel in order to hunt down Forerunner artifacts all across the galaxy, delivering teams to extract this material and get it back up into the ship. But of course, to keep the peace, to control the Covenant Empire, it also doubles as a warship. We can see mounted along the neck are these large communication arrays, and again, this could be used to coordinate the efforts of research teams all across a planet or even solar system, but it also helps to coordinate fleet attacks, monitoring thousands of smaller ships and coordinating planetary occupations. Like most Covenant capital ships, it was powered by a pinch fusion reactor and used twin repulsor engines for sublight propulsion, alongside a borer platform slipspace drive for faster-than-light travel, with the Covenant FTL systems being more accurate and faster than human slipspace drives. 4 sensor vanes mounted on the prow provided long-range detection capabilities, and we don't get specific crew numbers, but they always seem to be operated by an extremely small permanent crew, sometimes just a handful of people, compared to what might take hundreds of crew members on a UNSC ship. And this is thought to be due to the Covenant's extensive use of automation, with Huragok maintenance teams and hierarchically organized Sangheili command staffs. The Marathon actually had thousands of personnel on board. As for its armament, it is said to be dated. They really didn't replace these weapons, they just kept them for centuries. But of course that's because they still worked. With a single ventral Excellin pattern excavation beam, capable of both mining operations and devastating anti-ship or anti-surface attacks. Supporting this were 22 forward-mounted Morphin pattern plasma cannons, 6 Argument pattern plasma torpedo silos, and 60 Gone pattern pulse laser turrets for point defense against fighters, missiles, and other incoming craft. While just about all of these were far more deadly than anything the humans had, they were regarded as underpowered compared to the newer CCS-class battlecruiser, which was stronger in just about every way, even though, again, the Malgan is much larger. But they weren't fighting each other, at least not yet, and so compared to even some of the best stuff humanity had, like the Marathon, the lighter plasma weaponry of the Malgan would still boil off 6 feet of titanium armor plate in just seconds. A single plasma torpedo could compromise your hull. But one of the most mysterious systems on this ship is its ventral stasis enfolder system. Little is known about this device, though its name seems to suggest a relationship to the stasis tech used elsewhere in Covenant military equipment. It might be something like the stasis cannons used on the Bokoi Ni pattern vampire attack craft. Something like the ion weaponry in the galaxy far, far away. Things for immobilizing instead of destroying enemy ships. Shutting them down so that you can capture everybody alive. Now, the Covenant call this the Malgan, but the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, is where we get those 3-letter designations, and they call this the RCS-class armored cruiser. In ONI nomenclature, the R designation indicated a ship capable of reconnaissance and forerunner excavation duties. That deadly beam we think of with glassing was originally designed for excavation roles, for clearing out debris to get down to these ancient forerunner artifacts, while the S signified a dedicated combat vessel. We don't know what the C stands for. It's tempting to just think it stands for Covenant, but that seems too simple. But with this R and the S, it shows both its reconnaissance, this dual role of being used in combat. If you went up against this thing, you would just think it's a battleship, not that it had this whole other life as an archaeologist. And over the years, despite its declining status, the Malgan remained valuable because of its exceptional reliability. After the collapse of the Covenant, many advanced warships became difficult to maintain due to their loss of centralized shipyards. They also lost crucial Huragok technicians and just overall the industrial infrastructure needed for these precise parts. Because the Malgan pattern cruisers had survived so long already, it's this same build quality that allowed them to survive for even longer. And they actually proved far more resilient, allowing Sangheili warlords, Covenant remnant groups, and Jul'Madama's Covenant to continue operating major capital ships even in resource-poor environments, when the tables had turned and now the Covenant were the ones on the run. It's kind of cool to think about that it isn't odd that these older ships survived for longer. What's a few more decades when this ship was already being used for hundreds of years? And we would also see them used alongside the much smaller Xanar pattern light cruisers, as the Ket and Xanar all have the same look, the same design philosophy that came from the Malgan. So you have the larger Malgan and the much smaller at 300 meters long Xanar, all fighting together after the Covenant Empire collapsed. One of these ancient cruisers was famously destroyed when the UNSC Infinity emerged from slipspace and rammed it. This was quite a symbolic moment here, as the Infinity worked in a lot of Covenant-based tech like shielding, and a lot of their sensor and slipspace data. They even worked with Huragok, and it's just enormous, something on a scale that humanity never produced, creating this event that was always the other way around. Throughout the 3 decades of the Human-Covenant War, no human ship was just running over some Covenant capital ship. It was always the other way around. These alien behemoths that took over human colony worlds, swallowing up the entire sky. Now a human ship was plowing right through this ship that had helped build the Covenant, and which itself was one of the largest Covenant cruisers. That's it for its breakdown. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. I can really use your help. Check out the store, tons of things mentioned in this video are in the store, and it all helps to keep this channel running. But most important of all, remember, the Maugan is a Covenant AK of a ship, and may the domain preserve you, always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This complete breakdown will pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. And check out the store linked under the video. That's my store, everything you buy helps to keep this channel running, and tons of things mentioned in these videos can be found in that store. Let's get into it. The Covenant's CCS class battlecruiser really is the most important and recognizable warships in the entire Covenant Navy, serving for centuries as the backbone of countless fleets across Covenant-controlled space. These massive cruisers gradually replaced the older Maugan pattern armored cruisers sometime between the 5th and 7th Age of Reclamation. We really have no clue what time that would be, how these Covenant ages relate to our timeline. The 5th and 7th Age are somewhere between the last 2,000 years. But eventually, the CCS became more numerous than almost any other Covenant capital ship. Produced across dozens of shipyards in many different patterns and subvariants, though the Ket pattern and Elephant pattern designs came to dominate this classification, forming the standard image most species associated with the Covenant battlecruiser. So although that term can technically mean a bunch of different ships, really it became synonymous with the Ket. Unlike specialized ships, like the brutally aggressive Sonaris pattern heavy destroyer, or the enormous Carroll pattern assault carrier, the battlecruiser was designed as highly versatile, capable of attack, occupation, fleet support, and planetary assault operations all in one ship. The closest UNSC parallel would be something like the Marathon-class heavy cruiser, and later Autumn class, in the sense that they should be able to slug it out in space, and launch an invasion force, and sustain those forces planetside. Though of course on a much larger scale with this Covenant ship, because the Ket measures 1,782 meters long, 862 meters wide, and weighs about 90.7 million metric tons, meaning it outclassed every UNSC ship encountered during the Human-Covenant War, with the Paris class being 535 meters, and even the Great Marathon being 1,192 meters. The Phoenix-class colony ship is longer at 2,500 meters, but this was originally intended just to be a colonizing vessel, something to just move enormous amounts of people and material. It's crazy to think that the Ket could have something like the carrying capacity of a Phoenix, but also as a frontline capital ship. It was powered by 2 pinch fusion reactors and driven by twin Gablian pattern repulsor engines, which gave this enormous vessel remarkable maneuverability, both in space and within planetary atmospheres. And like most of the Covenant ships, it employed an Orphan pattern borer slipspace drive, superior to the human equivalent, and this allowed for fast interstellar travel with incredible accuracy, which all helped to maintain fleet cohesion, making sure everybody arrived at the same time at the right place, crucial when you're fielding as many vessels as the Covenant did. The hull of this ship consists of layered nano-laminate armor, reinforced by that powerful Corvex pattern dispersal field generators, what makes up their energy shields. And these are strong enough to survive nearby nuclear detonations and take multiple Mach hits, all things that would quickly destroy human ships. But despite all this practical tech, they also have a sense of aesthetics, though with the shielding, we could imagine that form followed function here, as they are known for this elegance and fluidity in their design, with Covenant warships often resembling living sea creatures from Sangheili worlds. And the CCS might be one of the best examples of this aesthetic, with sweeping curves, smooth contours, and near-perfect symmetry, with its iconic ventral fins serving as sophisticated sensor arrays. And this overall design became so influential that later Covenant ships like the Xanar pattern light cruiser directly evolved from the Ket and Elephant hull architecture. Looking inside the ship, we see that it functions almost like a mobile city or fortress monastery. Modular bays throughout the cruiser could be converted into engineering centers, barracks, armories, medical facilities, storage chambers, or religious sanctuaries depending on the operational needs. Perfectly suited for their high-tech holy war, this flexibility made the battlecruiser ideal for long-term occupation campaigns, where Covenant fleets might remain in-system for extended periods, while subjugating an entire species. And it carried an enormous complement compared to other Covenant ships, with it normally having around 180 obedientaries, 2,500 warriors, and over 4,100 thralls, alongside a wide array of vehicles and aerospace craft. It could deploy up to 50 Banshee flyers, 32 Seraph interceptors, or Kelgeric pattern Tarask fighters, 10 Spirit or Phantom dropships, 55 insertion pods, 48 Wraith mortar tanks, 150 Ghost scouts, 44 Rua pattern shadow transports, and 20 Resisho pattern Tick boarding craft. This gave the battlecruiser a level of combined arms capability rivaling dedicated human assault carriers. Again, it's doing in this all-in-one ship what humanity usually needs to do across several specialized ships. The Epoch-class heavy carrier and Phoenix-class support ships could transport more troops and vehicles, but the whole point is that Covenant battlecruisers integrate fleet combat and planetary invasion into a single platform. And this emphasis on planetary assault is reflected in the ship's famous gravity lift system. Mounted ventrally beneath the cruiser was a massive gravity beam capable of transporting personnel, armored vehicles, equipment, and supplies directly to a planet's surface. The CCS carried a detachable, circular deployment platform with 6 interlocking hinges that could descend under controlled repulsion and anchor itself to the ground below. Once deployed, it's like a gravity elevator. Covenant troops and materiel could move continuously between ship and surface with extraordinary speed and efficiency. And just like the systems aboard the gigantic CAS-class assault carrier and the colossal Shawada pattern supercarrier, the gravity lift assembly also doubled as the firing aperture for this ship's most devastating weapon, this beam that would become infamous in its ability to glass planets. Deep within the cruiser was the Command Center, or Combat Information Center, where the ship's operations were coordinated through vast holographic interfaces and tactical displays. Unlike the relatively compact and utilitarian bridges of most UNSC warships, Covenant CIC chambers were enormous ceremonial spaces centered around elevated command platforms reserved for high-ranking Sanghili and Sanshayum officers. Holographic displays could show real-time tactical overlays, security feeds, ship schematics, or direct visual projections of the surrounding battlefield. And of course, there is that immense hangar system that's actually 4 bisected hangar bays, 2 port and 2 starboard, with each of them stretching across 3 vertical layers, capable of housing all those things listed out before, the dropships, banshees, and armored vehicles. Energy barriers sealed the hangar openings while still allowing craft to pass freely, preserving atmospheric pressure inside the ship even during combat operations. Massive, conventional elevators, not gravity lifts, just normal elevators linked the bays, connecting them to lower cargo and deployment areas, enabling these fast launch cycles seen during invasions and fleet engagements. But of course, the true terror of the CCS class lay in its firepower. They were among the most heavily armed cruisers fielded during the war, carrying a weapon suite designed to obliterate both ships and planetary targets, with a standard ket having a Profero pattern excavation beam, an Ignis pattern plasma lance, 42 Sono pattern plasma cannons, 16 Serpens pattern plasma torpedo silos, and 50 Gon pattern pulse laser turrets. The excavation beam and plasma lance served as the ship's primary heavy weapons, capable of gutting UNSC warships in a matter of seconds, or carving through planetary surfaces during glassing operations. The 42 plasma cannons provided devastating broadside capabilities, while the plasma torpedo silos launched superheated magnetic plasma warheads, capable of overheating human point defense systems. These torpedoes were powered directly by the ship's primary pinch fusion reactors, with inert plasma cores stored inside the vessel's wing structures before ignition and launch. The 50 pulse laser turrets provided point defense coverage against missiles, fighters, and boarding craft, giving the battlecruiser defensive coverage that was superior to most human ships. Human ships like the Marathon or Valiant emphasized magnetic accelerator cannons and missile salvos, requiring concentrated firepower and coordinated fleet tactics to break Covenant shields. But Covenant battlecruisers instead focused on sustained plasma bombardment backed by advanced shielding tech in the energy beam weapons. Because of this balance between firepower, durability, troop capacity, and operational flexibility, the CCS class became the defining symbol of Covenant naval power, being a mobile cathedral that could deploy troops and supplies or just glass a planet. And as for its history, it entered service in the 7th Age of Reclamation, replacing the increasingly outdated Malgan pattern armored cruisers that had served the Empire for generations, likely hundreds of years. These are built in immense numbers across dozens of Covenant shipyards, and it rapidly became the most common and strategically important warship in Covenant space, serving alongside the almost equally widespread Elephant pattern. They influenced the later Xanar pattern light cruisers, which were almost like these overpowered policing vessels. And by the time of the Human Covenant War, the silhouette of the CCS class had become infamous throughout human space. Even inexperienced UNSC cadets could immediately recognize the sleek, curved hull and distinctive ventral fins of the Covenant battlecruiser, really showing how often these vessels appeared in fleet engagements and planetary assaults. They took part in the devastating Battle of Harvest, humanity's first major encounter with the Covenant, where they showed off their horrifyingly superior naval tech. During the campaign, these battlecruisers routinely annihilated UNSC frigates and destroyers, whose MAC rounds struggled to penetrate Covenant shielding. And it was the same scene unfolding across dozens of human colonies during the next decades, as this war lasted almost 30 years, with a single CCS often overpowering multiple human cruisers in direct combat. About 15 years into the war, they became especially feared for their role in planetary invasions and glassing operations. While larger ships like the CAS class assault carrier carried greater troop complements and heavier energy projectors, the CCS had this ideal balance of mobility, transport capability, and still devastating firepower. The Covenant would deploy groups of battlecruisers ahead of larger carriers in order to establish orbital superiority, and then deploy invasion forces via those gravity lifts. Their immense complements of Banshees, Wraiths, Ghosts, and Seraph fighters would allow them to function as independent occupation platforms, capable of subjugating entire colonies without direct support. And as the war escalated toward humanity's core territories, they would still be seen in every major naval action, playing a central role in the catastrophic fall of Reach. During this assault, enormous fleets composed largely of CCS and CAS class vessels overwhelmed humanity's most heavily defended military stronghold besides Earth itself. They formed the core of the Fleet of Particular Justice, which was under the command of Supreme Commander Thel Vadami, the Sangheili commander we would later know as the Arbiter. After the destruction of Reach, many of these ships pursued the UNSC Pillar of Autumn through Slipspace to Installation 04, unknowingly leading both humanity and the Covenant directly to the first Halo ring encountered during this war. One of the most famous ships of this class was the Truth and Reconciliation, which became one of the defining locations of the Installation 04 campaign. Damaged during combat with the Pillar of Autumn, the battlecruiser was forced to land on the Halo ring surface, where it became the primary Covenant command center for all the operations on this installation, serving as the headquarters for the Sangheili commander Zuka Zamimi, and later for the Prophet of Stewardship during the increasingly desperate campaign against both UNSC survivors and the emerging Flood outbreak. Eventually, this vessel too became infested by Flood forms, turning this once proud battlecruiser into a plague-ridden death trap before it was destroyed by ODSTs. The fate of Truth and Reconciliation became symbolic for the wider disaster that was overtaking both the Covenant and humanity, as this enormous ship was taken over by something that spread by tiny spores. No ship would prove stronger than the Flood. In the final months of the war, they played a major role in the invasion of the Sol system. When the High Prophet of Regret arrived at Earth, his flagship, Solemn Penance, was escorted by 13 battlecruisers belonging to the Fleet of Sacred Consecration. These ships participated in brutal orbital engagements over Earth and supported Covenant ground assaults across East Africa and other regions. Soon after, the reinforcement fleets sent by the High Prophet of Truth also relied heavily on these battlecruisers. Like I've said, they're at the core of just about every single engagement. The collapse of the Covenant Empire during the Great Schism saw the CCS class dragged into the massive civil war between Sangheili and Jiralhanae factions. Cruisers that had once fought side by side against humanity now turned their plasma lances and torpedoes against one another, in these vicious battles with various warlords across Covenant-controlled space. Sangheili separatists, Jiralhanae warlords, and countless splinter groups all seized control of surviving battlecruisers as the Empire fragmented. And because so many of these ships existed across the Covenant fleet, they of course were still the most common capital ships used by the post-war factions. Even years after the Covenant's fall, the CCS remained widespread throughout former Covenant territory, and many of them would face off against the UNSC Infinity, that great human vessel which incorporated a lot of Covenant tech and the many lessons learned over those 30 years of fighting, while those like the mercenary warlord Vada Gajat held on to numerous CCS classes in his private fleet. There were Kig-Yar scavenger bands that had them, countless pirate clans, and independent Sangheili keeps, though the greatest concentration was likely in the hands of Jul 'Madama's Covenant. Much like the aging UNSC cruisers that continued serving decades after their construction, these Covenant battlecruisers proved so effective and adaptable that it remained as one of the dominant capital ships of the post-war era, many decades after the empire that created them had collapsed. So that's it for the CCS class, the Ket pattern. Again, if you can please just hit that like button, it really does help me out. And check out the store, I'm sure you'll find something cool. And anything you pick up there helps to keep this channel running. But most important of all, remember, if the ship's still deadly, who cares how old it is? And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I can really use your help. And check out my store linked under the video. There are LEGO compatible builds of many things mentioned in these videos. Tons of cool stuff there, and anything you buy helps to keep this channel running. But let's get into it. The Xanar Pattern Light Cruiser, identified by the UNSC under the Hull Classification Code CRS, was one of the smallest true Covenant warships regularly encountered during the Human Covenant War, and in the unstable decades that followed the Covenant Empire's collapse. Built by the Covenant's secondary assembly forges and remaining in service from the 6th Age of Conflict onward, the ship occupied an unusual position inside Covenant naval doctrine. To humanity, it was still a dangerous alien cruiser equipped with energy shielding, plasma weaponry, and advanced propulsion systems that vastly exceeded the capabilities of most comparable UNSC warships. But within the Covenant, it was regarded as a relatively low-status attack ship, intended more for policing, patrolling, and interdiction roles, or even for reconnaissance and support operations, rather than grand fleet engagements associated with the battlecruisers and assault carriers. Measuring around 300 meters long and 145 meters wide, and with a mass of around 190,000 metric tons, compared to the Covenant Navy's more famous warships, this thing was very small, with the Ket Pattern battlecruiser, also called the CCS class, being 1,782 meters long. The ship that was the Covenant's primary line warships, with those immense plasma weapon arrays, troop complements, Seraph fighter contingents, and enough firepower to devastate entire cities, or conduct planetary glassing operations. And then there's the even larger Siphon Pattern Assault Carrier, or CAS class, which was more than 5.3 kilometers long, and functioned as a mobile invasion fortress, capable of transporting entire armies and fleets simultaneously. So the Ket, or CCS, was nearly 6 times its length. The CAS is around 16 times as long. Even many UNSC frigates, like the Paris and Stalwart, were longer than this Covenant ship, and the Marathon is almost 3 times as long. But of course, that doesn't mean these human ships were stronger, or better defended. Covenant technology fundamentally distorted this relationship between size and combat power. And though it's not enormous, it did still have an intimidation factor, and even an air of wonder, with UNSC personnel frequently describing this cruiser as resembling a luminous manta ray, due to its smooth crescent-like hull, glowing energy systems, and flattened ventral structure. Its design was essentially a reduced-scale mutation of the larger Elephant Pattern and Ket Pattern battlecruisers, and though drastically smaller than those ships, the Xanar retained nearly identical proportions and silhouette, making it really resemble a miniature battlecruiser from a distance. and of course reflects this hundreds of years of continuity and Covenant aesthetics, where even the relatively mundane ships inherited the grandeur and elegance of the Empire's most prestigious warships. Though that being said, there are still some structural details that distinguish it from its larger relatives. The bow has a cluster of 4 sensor vanes that were notoriously prone to assembly aberrations. For whatever reason, they can vary wildly across different ships. And even stranger is that they can cause Forerunner systems to mistakenly recognize the cruiser as friendly. And so certain Xanar pattern ships were capable of bypassing Sentinel defenses or automated Forerunner security systems, an ability that became particularly valuable during operations involving Forerunner installations and shield worlds. At the ship's rear, we see housed 2 repulsor engines and their associated control coils, and we know that these coils required extremely careful calibration. If improperly tuned during high-power operation, this system could induce severe disorientation and hallucinations among crew members. A lot of things can get funky at such high power output levels. The ship's central neck section also contained launch points for Covenant drop pods and assault carapaces. These orbital entry vehicles, a lot like what's seen with the ODSTs, and this corresponds to the 4 large circular lights seen on the vessel's ventral surface. These are what's used during the Requiem campaign in 2558, deploying these Glodo pattern and Glodo-Kef pattern assault carapaces directly into the core of Requiem, showing how this thing could be used during rapid insertions and raiding these Forerunner sites. And though it did lack the massive trooper deployment capacity of these larger capital ships, it still did have at least one hangar bay capable of supporting several Phantom dropships or a ton of other small craft. The CRS's power systems centered on a fusion pinch reactor, feeding all the ship's weapons, shields, and propulsion systems. And like almost all Covenant ships, it had a dedicated slipspace drive, a system that was superior than that of humans, allowing for both faster and more precise interstellar travel. Covenant slipspace capabilities would remain dramatically superior throughout most of the Human Covenant War, and the cruiser's auger arrays and sensor vanes allowed it to excel in reconnaissance and artifact recovery missions, which of course were central to many Covenant operations. In fact, as silly as this is, all those 3-letter classifications of Covenant ships, it isn't known what each of those letters mean. The only 3 that we are explicitly told is that O stands for ordained, meaning the ship is enhanced with Forerunner tech. R stands for reverence, meaning that these ships were used during reconnaissance missions and excavating Forerunner artifacts. And S stands for salvation. This was for dedicated warships capable of cleansing the enemy with holy fire. You might think C stands for Covenant, but really I don't think that's it. I mean, when you see these other ones, it's not that on the nose. But that shows us that Oni considered that these ships were used both for warfare and for reconnaissance. Another confusing detail is the crew requirements. It's listed as only requiring a single superior, who held the rank and title of shipmaster, and 8 menials, the people that worked under the superior. So only 9 people on this ship? It really could just show how many of these systems were automated. Maybe we shouldn't think this is strange. Maybe we should think the really high crew numbers of other ships is what should be abnormal. And for reference, things like the Ket pattern, which again is almost 6 times its size, has 8 superiors, 2 Huragok, and 500 menials. But it's doing much more complicated things, with a much larger complement and way more weapons. If you can help figure this out, please comment down below. And under usual conditions, the Xanar had no permanent troop complement, which really sets it apart from the larger Covenant ships like the CCS and CAS, which could deploy thousands of warriors, vehicles, and aircraft during planetary invasions. But in the post-war era, where everything was fractured and regional warlords were relying more on their Xanar, they tried to pack in a ton of troops. And for its weaponry, it is relatively modest by Covenant standards, but still devastating when you compare it to most UNSC escorts. Its primary weapon system is a pair of Eric's pattern plasma beam emitters and 6 top-mounted Sintra pattern plasma torpedo silos. The plasma torpedoes launched by these silos were exceptionally fast, but notoriously difficult to steer accurately, making them more useful for bombardment and saturation attacks instead of precision ship-to-ship engagements. On the ship's underside, you have these 4 POC pattern beam lasers linked to dedicated auger targeting arrays. and these could be used to rapidly engage dozens of targets in succession. Unlike the heavier plasma torpedoes, these high-energy beam lasers specialized in precision strikes with minimal collateral damage, really pointing to the cruiser's role as a policing and enforcement vessel operating around Covenant colonies and infrastructure before the Human-Covenant War. But these are still extremely dangerous to human ships. While the Paris-class heavy frigate has that powerful MAC and Archer missile pods, it doesn't have shielding, and so these plasma beams and torpedoes would just transfer immense energy, melting through armor and superheating entire compartments of the ship. That's why smaller ships like this CRS could take on human warships that were multiples its size. And for defense, it had the standard Covenant energy shielding, backed by nano-laminate hull plating, and this armor was significantly more advanced than UNSC Titanium A armor, so it could absorb punishment for longer and then near instantly cripple human ships. Though of course concentrated volleys of MAC fire could crack even the biggest Covenant shields, so as humanity learned better tactics, of course they could take these out quicker than the larger ships. And again, its intended role was never for frontline warfare. ONI classified it as a cruiser, but it really does function more like a police cutter or security patrol ship, protecting shipping lanes, suppressing piracy, and upholding the edicts from High Charity, enforcing them all throughout Covenant territory. But it is because of that comparatively mundane role that these crews proved to be unusually aggressive in battle. When they got an actual taste of war, the Sangheili officers that commanded these saw this as their chance at glory. Most Sangheili feared being assigned to these, as it did not even merit a formal shipmaster's chair or many of the ceremonial distinctions associated with larger warships. In fact, it was most often assigned to lower caste species like the Kigyar or Jiralhani. Service aboard the ship was usually seen as a stepping stone toward assignment to more prestigious vessels, and so when they could prove themselves in battle, they usually tried to take their shot. And this class proved unexpectedly effective against UNSC naval forces, prompting the commanders of larger ships to use them even more. And so there was kind of a snowball effect where the Xanar became more and more important to the Covenant war effort. Though of course you can imagine all the ego and bureaucratic positioning. I'm sure these commanders were reminded that they were still beneath the larger ship commanders. Now we don't have an exact date for when these were first introduced. All we know is that the first age of conflict, as the Covenant calls it, was in our year 938 BCE, and the Xanar pattern light cruiser comes about in the 6th age of conflict, being a stable offshoot of the much larger battlecruiser patterns already in widespread service throughout the Empire. And like I said, though clearly descended from the Elephant and Ket, it is smaller and specialized, and helped to maintain peace. Though they would play early roles in the Human Covenant War and some of the earliest encounters, like the Battle of Kai Seti in 2525. And as the war intensified, we see them in increasing use, like during the massive Battle of Serpentis in 2543, and later in the Fall of Reach, playing major roles along Ceudar pattern heavy corvettes in the Siege of Kasba City, and in 2552 they were deployed during the Covenant occupation of Earth itself, showing how this relatively minor Covenant ship became fully integrated into major strategic operations as the war escalated towards its end. And it would become one of the most important ships after the collapse of the Covenant and the onset of the Great Schism, where we start to see things like the infamous heavily modified cruiser Spear of Light, commanded by the Sanshayum prelate Tem Behetek. During the chaos surrounding the fall of High Charity, this ship rescued the Minister of Preparation before setting out on a brutal anti-Sangheili campaign driven by Tem's personal vendetta against Vadam. The Spear of Light would destroy multiple Sangheili-controlled ships, including a massive CAS class named the Eternal Reward, and it went on to attack Sangheili colonies and ambush the famous assault carrier Shadow of Intent, really demonstrating just how powerful this could be under aggressive leadership and with expertly deployed unconventional tactics. But when its boarding action against the Shadow of Intent failed, the cruiser was captured, and its navigation data ultimately led the Sangheili to a prototype Halo installation. But perhaps no faction relied on the Xanar pattern more heavily than Jul 'Mdama's Covenant. After raiding an abandoned Imperial stockade on a moon once orbited by High Charity, Jul secured a massive reserve of light cruisers and used them to form the backbone of his growing fleet. These ships became central to his campaigns around the Shield World Requiem, where many Xanars accompanied him to the system before and during the Battle of Requiem in 2557, where they were originally dispatched to investigate the drifting wreckage of the UNSC forward onto Dawn. And it's one of these cruisers that was destroyed by the frigate's Hyperion missile systems, that nuke that Master Chief personally activates. And this class also played a direct role in the release of the Didact. 3 Xanar pattern cruisers executing a slipspace jump directly into Requiem's core, with the goal of deploying troops near the installation housing the Didact's cryptum. At least one of these cruisers was destroyed when the gravity distortions generated by the Didact's cryptum entering slipspace dragged the vessel into a catastrophic gravitational well. And later during this campaign, several Xanars would go up against the UNSC Infinity, though at least 2 were destroyed by the Infinity's defense systems and surface-to-air missile batteries. We also see them taking part in the Didact's raid on Ivanov Station, deploying phantom dropships to interfere with the evacuation efforts around the station. And the occupation of Requiem throughout late 2557 and early 2558 saw these cruisers deployed constantly in both patrol and combat roles. One of the most notable ships, named Panem's Canticle, was assigned to oversee the refuge site on Requiem, and we see many of them escorting the Malgun pattern armored cruisers during these major engagements against the UNSC Infinity and its Trident-class heavy frigates. And though we keep seeing them being destroyed, we also keep seeing them, and they would be a persistent threat throughout the entire campaign, and really these several years after the fall of the Covenant. In July 2558, we see them used in a really unique way in this battle over Actis IV, where many of these light cruisers were concealed beneath the planet's oceans as part of Jul 'Mdama's trap for the UNSC Infinity and Dr. Catherine Halsey. These successfully prevented the UNSC's greatest ship from being able to move freely in low orbit for more than 7 hours. Again, you really can't just dismiss these for being much smaller ships. And after the fall of Jul 'Mdama's Covenant, it would still see widespread use among these post-war factions. The Swords of Sang Helios had them, and by 2560, many are escorting the Hekar Ta pattern blockade runners during these major battles over Subon against banished fleets, composed of Karvs and dreadnoughts. You can really see how far this ship came from being one of the smallest Covenant craft, and one that was originally just supposed to be a policing vessel, all the way up to the attack on Earth, and at least a decade of use after that. If you made it this far, please hit that like button, it really does help out. And be sure to check out the store. There's builds for a ton of things mentioned in this video. I'm sure you'll find something you like, and it all helps to keep this channel running. But most important of all, remember, it doesn't really matter how small the ship is, if it's packed full of Covenant weaponry and defenses. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This breakdown will pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. And check out the store linked under the video. There's all sorts of cool stuff from different fandoms. Tons of things I cover in these videos are in my store, and everything you buy helps to keep this channel running. But let's get into it. The Ruma pattern light carrier, known to the UNSC under the 3-letter classification, the DDS class carrier, was one of the largest carrier warships operated by the Covenant, despite it having that deceptive title of a light carrier. Entering service during the 18th Age of Doubt, which again, if you've seen other Covenant ship breakdowns, we have no idea how that correlates to our timeline. For what it's worth, the 23rd Age of Doubt is from 2462 to 2525. So it's likely hundreds of years ago, meaning like many other Covenant ships, the Ruma served for many centuries, maybe even millennia, and would remain in operation even after the Covenant's collapse, serving primarily as a second-line fleet asset, or as a reserve fleet flagship, but also as a troop transport and strike craft delivery system, rather than a frontline battle fleet combatant. And although officially categorized as a light carrier, like I said, this thing is enormous, and so Covenant personnel and others often refer to this thing as a super carrier, distinguishing them from smaller carrier designs and more grouping them alongside the enormous Carroll pattern assault carriers, and other dedicated Covenant craft that do get that super carrier title. Because at 3,000 meters long and 1,186 meters wide, it does occupy this weird space among other Covenant craft. Nearly twice the length of the ubiquitous Ket pattern or CCS, which was 1,782 meters, though still around half the size of the immense Carroll pattern, which is more than 5,300 meters. This ship's mass is an astonishing 272 million tons, placing it among the heaviest Covenant vessels regularly encountered during the Human-Covenant War. And like we see across all their ships, no matter the size, it always has the same sort of aesthetic, with that Covenant preference for the sweeping, organic lines, and that distinctive three-pronged configuration. Though we arrive at one of the first issues of this ship, out of universe, there are no official images of the Ruma. Most of these images are going to be from the Sins of the Prophets mod for Sins of a Solar Empire, and they do not feature the three prongs at the front that we see with things like the CCS. Though those prongs are described in the primary source material for this ship, coming from the 2003 novel Halo First Strike. Usually I try to keep these things in-universe, but I did think this had to be mentioned. Like just about all Covenant warships, it was powered by the massive Pinch fusion reactor and equipped with repulsor engines for conventional propulsion. These are how it navigated through normal space, and for faster-than-light travel, it has a Ceudar Slipspace drive. Though these are always faster and more accurate than the human equivalent, for some reason the one in the Ruma is one of the slowest of Covenant warships. This is likely because it was not intended to get anywhere first. It was not a rapid response craft or a frontline fighter. So unlike the assault carriers, battle cruisers, or heavy cruisers that routinely spearheaded Covenant offenses across hundreds of light years, Rumas were usually stationed near fleet anchorage points, at logistics hubs, or defending major naval depots, where rapid strategic mobility was far less important. They were always supposed to be just reinforcing other assets. For its armor plating, it was protected by the Covenant nano-laminate armor, but these are of course backed up by their energy shields. Both the physical armor and energy armor in the form of shielding, each of those alone was more durable than the 6 feet of titanium A battleplate armor on most UNSC ships. It's part of what made the 30 years of the Human-Covenant War such an uphill battle for humanity. There were more Covenant ships, and each one of them was stronger, more powerful, and almost all of them were just bigger. This nanolaminate structure could tolerate temperatures approaching 300 degrees Celsius without suffering any meaningful damage, and you really had to get up above 1700 degrees Celsius before you even experienced minor hull tearing or conduit damage throughout the shield generator system. This really just shows off the Covenant's mastery of advanced material sciences, of course in part aided by working with so much Forerunner tech that they had searched the galaxy for thousands of years. The inside of the ship looked pretty close to just about every other Covenant capital ship. A whole lot of sleek purple surfaces, and the primary launch bay was situated on the ventral surface, and we know it housed at least 6 Seraph fighters. Though of course it had much more than that. This thing was almost twice the size of the CCS, and that was described as carrying enough forces for a planetary invasion. And like I said, informally, everybody just referred to this as a super carrier, even if it had that technical light carrier designation. We also get a lot of details that it did look like the Ket or CCS inside, and so this often used cross-section, and what we saw in the Belly of the Beast during the Installation 04 campaign. Picture this, but with more Huragok engineers running throughout the vessel, with an overall crew number that is always surprisingly low, as the Covenant ships had the Huragok, but also better automation systems. Some passageways on this ship, though, were so narrow that Sangheili personnel could not fit inside of them. A really unique detail that shows us how Covenant ships were often designed around the unique maintenance requirements of their engineer caste. While the bridge reflected Covenant command philosophy, being around 20 meters in diameter, arranged around a central raised platform surrounded by floating holographic control surfaces. A recessed pit occupied the center of the room, while floor-to-ceiling status displays covered the walls, providing real-world information about the ship's operations, and likely the surrounding battlefield. 20 decks lay below the engineering complex, where the carrier's enormous fusion reactor would take up most of that space, and this area was connected to the bridge via elevators and maintenance corridors, the ones that only the Huragok or even smaller aliens could enter. The reactor itself is said to be 10 meters high, about 3 stories, and it's unclear if it has just one reactor or several like we see in other Covenant ships. The official complement was around 3,000 personnel, said to include 100 Sangheili officers, a light company of Ungoi laborers and support troops, But compare that to the Covenant assault carriers that could transport tens of thousands of warriors, along with dozens of vehicles and support personnel. Instead of being aimed at initiating and maintaining ground operations, this is more for launching fighter squadrons. And said that pilots would actually rotate between active war zones and using the Ruma more for rest and training time. And so command of a Ruma was often entrusted to relatively junior Sangheili officers. Rather than being considered prestigious assignments, the ships served as proving grounds where aspiring commanders could demonstrate leadership, work out tactical judgments, and even devotions to Covenant doctrine, as these were attached to research operations. Like mentioned with some of the other ships, things like the glassing beam of the CCS is called the excavation beam because it really was used for archaeological missions, as the Covenant would go across the galaxy trying to unearth old Forerunner tech. If you prove yourself on a Ruma, you would hope to be promoted to something like the Ket pattern battlecruisers, Varric pattern heavy cruisers, or even the Carroll pattern assault carriers. As no one is surprised to hear, there was a very strict hierarchical structure in place throughout the Covenant military, proving yourself across increasingly more difficult and thus more prestigious roles. Now, despite its enormous dimensions, it was surprisingly lightly armed when compared to other Covenant capital ships. Unlike the Carroll pattern, whose energy projectors could glass planetary surfaces and annihilate entire UNSC task forces, or the Varric pattern heavy cruiser with its advanced Forerunner enhanced weapons core, the Ruma didn't have any super heavy offensive systems. Its primary battery consists of just 2 Ignis pattern plasma lances. Those are kind of the backup weapons seen on the much smaller Ket pattern. Now, that doesn't mean those are objectively weak, they're just subjectively less than what you'd expect compared to other Covenant craft. But these were still concentrated beams of superheated plasma, literally boiling off 6 feet thick battle plate armor, melting through the biggest and baddest UNSC ships out there. Supporting these lances were 7 Morphin pattern plasma cannons, weapons that actually descend from those mounted on the older Malgan pattern armored cruiser, along with 8 Argument pattern plasma torpedo silos that provided long-range bombardment capability. Those too just melt straight through UNSC armor. Defense came from an extensive network of 57 pole pattern pulse laser turrets designed to intercept incoming missiles, fighters, and boarding craft. But a key component of the vessel's weapons architecture was its magnetic field multiplier system. This Covenant tech functioned as a sophisticated plasma focusing mechanism, shaping and directing plasma discharges to improve accuracy and overall destructive power. During Operation First Strike, Cortana exploited this system aboard the ship Ascendant Justice, modifying the carrier's plasma weapons to generate beam-like attacks resembling plasma lances. The resulting enhancements allowed the captured vessel to engage and destroy Covenant warships with an effectiveness far beyond its original design parameters. And it's a neat look at a human AI running a Covenant ship, optimizing it beyond what even their engineers thought was possible. Now, in fleet operations, it fulfilled a role somewhat analogous to the large UNSC fleet carriers and troop transports, things like the Punic-class supercarrier or Epoch-class carrier, that balanced aerospace operations with direct fleet support. But the Ruma is kind of emphasizing more strategic mobility, occupation duties, and just deploying fighters. The most famous vessel of this class is undoubtedly Ascendant Justice, assigned to the Fleet of Particular Justice during the Battle of Installation 04. And it initially served as the command seat of the Minor Prophet of Stewardship. Political tension eventually forced Fleet Master Thel Vadami to personally confront the Prophet aboard the vessel, after which the Prophet relocated his operations elsewhere in this campaign. And following the destruction of Halo, Ascendant Justice fell into UNSC hands and became one of the most valuable prizes ever captured during the Human Covenant War. How sad is it that it's one of the weakest of the Covenant ships? This had to be maddening to know that it was so much larger than a CCS, but then see under the hood, as it were, and kind of be underwhelmed. Commanded by Vice Admiral Danforth Whitcomb and aided by Cortana and the surviving Spartans, it still ends up playing a central role in Operation First Strike, before ultimately being destroyed. And the only last thing to note is that we don't know what DDS stands for in the ONI Covenant Ship classification system. All we know is that the S stands for Salvation, which means that the ship was classified as a dedicated warship, which is kind of odd when the history on this ship actually says that its combat role is the least important aspect of the Ruma. But when UNSC forces came across this thing, it was providing many of the strike craft that were delivering devastating blows to UNSC ships. That's it for its breakdown. Please, if you can hit that like button, it really does help me out. And check out the store, I'm sure you'll find something cool. But most important of all, remember, there's no such thing as a weak, superheated plasma lance. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This breakdown will pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. And check out the store linked under the video. There's tons of stuff from all sorts of fandoms, and you get 10% off using the link in the description. But let's get into it. Now we're breaking down the CAS class assault carrier, which is a term that can apply to both the Carroll pattern and Siphon pattern. This is a point that I don't want to stress in every video for the Covenant, but they often get these 3-letter designations that can apply to more than one type of pattern. But the ships within these groups are often so similar that they're near identical, and to be honest, in the lore you're usually only seeing one type of pattern. But here, the Siphon is the most common and recognizable variant of the CAS design, serving as one of the primary fleet flagships throughout the Covenant Empire. Although nearly identical in size, armament, and overall capability to the rarer Carroll pattern, the Siphon could be distinguished by its more elaborate external architecture. The most obvious details here would be the dorsal surfaces that are covered in these segments of armor plating and numerous towering skyscraper-like structures that give this version the appearance of it being a floating city. And that would reflect a common Covenant design philosophy, in which major warships functioned not only as military vessels, but also as mobile centers of administration, worship, and habitation. Remember, you're bringing entire species into the Covenant, and so these are often cathedral, capitol building, and warship all in one. While the Carroll pattern has a much smoother and more streamlined outer hull, but with all their assault carriers, they have this immense internal volume, allowing it to house far more than most UNSC warships. Some of these ships even had extensive nature preserves, comparable to those carried aboard the Majoran pattern agricultural support ships. Those are really cool, and I'm going to do a breakdown on those soon. One of the most famous examples of this was the carrier Solemn Penance, where the High Prophet of Regret maintained a large preserve that served as a private sanctuary, but also as his place of doing official business. Think of it like Central Park in the middle of the most industrialized place on the planet. This high-tech supership had an entire nature preserve. And these are among the largest frontline warships ever employed during the Human Covenant War, measuring 5,347 meters, or 3.3 miles long, 2,118 meters, or over a mile wide, and 746 meters, nearly half a mile tall, which meant that it dwarfed nearly every vessel in the UNSC Navy. And at around 2.7 billion tons, it outweighed even humanity's largest warship, the UNSC Infinity, by almost 2 times. Although the Infinity was longer overall, the Covenant carrier's tremendous beam and immense internal volume gave it a vastly greater capacity for troops, vehicles, and all sorts of aerospace assets. Its hull was constructed of nanolaminate battleplate, that advanced Covenant armor material that repeatedly demonstrated its superiority over the human titanium A plating. So it's stronger outright, but it's also reinforced by the powerful energy shielding systems capable of absorbing nukes before it fails. That's nukes plural, and it'd always take multiple Mac rounds to crack a shield. Its bridge was housed inside an armored command pod located at the center of this neck section, protected by multiple redundant shield generators and inertial compensation systems. Basically, you couldn't damage. This was the brain of the ship and the most protected. And it's an engineering reflection of Covenant doctrine, where the elites are the most protected. And we also know that the ship has a Blade Master's Yard, where Sangheili warriors could train in these extensive habitat domes, using similar things to the Prophet's hunting preserves. And there was a site called the Nave of the Creators, a shrine dedicated to the worship of the Forerunners, which was located at the ship's aft section, toward the rear. One of the most unusual engineering features of the Carroll pattern was its use of modular dispersal technology. Unlike most Covenant ships, large portions of this vessel could be detached from the rest of the hull while still retaining significant operational capabilities. The upper front section retained its own repulsor engines and slipspace drive, allowing it to withdraw independently if the lower sections suffered irreparable damage. So although I was cynical about it matching the hierarchical views here, it is a pretty neat engineering feat that instead of tons of smaller escape craft, the entire nerve center can just break away and turn into its own ship. And it's not like those other sections are rendered useless. They could still be firing at targets and deploying their fighter wings, basically operating independently, keeping the fight going as long as possible. Power was provided by a massive deuterium-tritium pinch fusion reactor located within the upper hull. Covenant fusion technology was significantly more efficient than the UNSC equivalents, allowing enormous power generation from comparatively compact systems. And sometimes those systems weren't compact, so they were both larger and more efficient. Propulsion came from 3 Rayfus pattern repulsor engines, which enabled operation in both space and atmosphere. And like just about all Covenant warships, they could perform precision slipspace transitions even within planetary atmospheres, something far beyond the capacity of most UNSC ships. These jumps generated devastating electromagnetic pulses and atmospheric shockwaves, seen famously on Earth in 2552. Superluminal travel, or faster than light, was handled by a Primus pattern borer slipspace drive, which is said to be equivalent to a Coden Series 6 translite engine. But again, the Covenant tech is usually more efficient and better in every other category. While its armament reflects this role as both a fleet command vessel and planetary assault platform, with its primary weapon being a single Infernus pattern super heavy excavation beam, and these were originally designed for the excavation of Forerunner artifacts, but came to be infamous for their ability to glass planetary surfaces. These could slice right through the most hardened UNSC ships and even planet-side fortifications. It could get at things like deep bunkers because that's exactly what it was designed to do. It was an archaeological tool. Like dynamite being used to clear Earth away, great for transportation and civilization building in general, but also has this very deadly function.
It's going to take more than faith to move this mountain. It's a job for dynamite. There's 50,000 tons of it, of the mountain I mean, and as for the dynamite, they're going to see what 20,000 pounds of it can do. Our cameraman thinks it's going to change the geography of Wisconsin.
Supporting that excavation beam were 2 Orpion-patterned super heavy plasma lances. These weapons were some of the Covenant's most feared anti-capital ship systems. Drawing directly from the ship's central reactor, plasma lances project concentrated streams of magnetically contained plasma, which are usually just as capable of boiling straight through UNSC warships as its main beam. It's kind of like saying a 50 cal is more deadly to the human skull than a 9mm. I mean, it's true, but practically, these weaker plasma lances were often more than enough. And then they have 8 Luxor pattern heavy plasma beam emitters and 24 Myctex pattern heavy plasma torpedo silos. It's these plasma torpedoes that were of the most strategically significant weapons of the Human Covenant War. Guided by advanced targeting systems and protected by their own energy containment fields, these torpedoes could overwhelm UNSC defenses through sheer destructive power. And it's the fact that they can track moving targets, whereas all the beam weaponry is line of sight, firing at one spot for a few seconds. You fire your torpedoes and let them do their thing. They'll follow the target through the battlefield while you're attacking other threats with your other weaponry. And of course, they can even track things behind objects. Crucial when the UNSC starts developing more hit-and-run tactics, those wolf packs of ships that I talk about in some other videos, that can try and hide behind some moon or asteroid field. It was crucial that the Covenant also had these plasma torpedoes. And then this carrier also has an incredible 700 Ferial pattern pulse laser turrets. These are for providing point defense coverage against fighters, missiles, and boarding craft, and all kinds of other smaller threats. Those pesky Spartans were genius at using anything they could get their hands on. But compared to things like the Ket pattern battlecruiser, or the Varric pattern heavy cruiser, the Carroll actually has substantially more firepower, while still having all that extra tech for security, all that point defense coverage, and then the layers of shields over a section of a ship that can become its own escape pod. it has much more endurance and survivability. But as is often the case with Covenant ships, their crew requirements are incredibly small. This whole thing is run by 200 superiors and 10 engineers, a testament to the Covenant automation and the efficiency of Huragok-assisted maintenance systems. A UNSC ship of this size likely would have had crew around at least 1,000, if not thousands. The Autumn class had a crew of 800. But while the tech is impressive and the armament is incredibly deadly, the vessel's true purpose and its true strength lay in the forces it could deliver planet-side. Under ideal conditions, this carrier could transport around 40,000 warriors, with ground forces that include 3 Scarab platforms among the Covenant's most feared assault walkers, those towering war machines that combine heavy armor, excavation beams, and their own troop carrying capability into a single battlefield asset. While supporting that were 196 Wraith tanks, the Covenant's primary armored vehicle, launching those devastating plasma mortar attacks. Reconnaissance and rapid attack duties were handled by 700 Ghost scout vehicles, while 44 shadow transports moved infantry across combat zones. This complement alone rivaled the entire armored strength of many UNSC expeditionary forces, all packed into a single ship that the Covenant seemed to have endless amounts of. And its aerospace wing was equally impressive, with 8 massive hangars lining the vessel's lower hull, large enough to accommodate captured UNSC frigates. It packed in 250 insertion pods, 44 Spirit or Phantom dropships, and 20 Tick boarding craft for trying to capture those UNSC ships. Escort and attack functions were provided by 600 Banshee flyers, 192 Alceta pattern space-capable Banshee strike craft, and 68 Seraph fighters. It's the Seraph that really represents the Covenant's equivalent of a space superiority fighter, consistently outperforming most UNSC spacecraft in terms of both speed and firepower. And then there are the Wren transport shuttles, which supported logistics and personnel movement throughout the ship. Ships within ships to get troops ready to get on their ships. The sheer scale of this force that exceeded many dedicated UNSC carrier groups and even rivals the complements found on the Covenant's largest fleet command vessels. So when you take all of that together, you do see 2 Covenant philosophies coming together here. Sheer overwhelming force in terms of the weaponry, but also the ships and vehicles and troops, and that dedication to protecting their VIPs. With these very unique specialized technologies to make sure that whatever commander was capable of running a ship like this, those leadership skills were not lost in combat. And as for its history, it was designated under the category of Examiner warships, something reserved for the Empire's most strategically valuable capital vessels. These are not just weapons of war, but sacred instruments of the Great Journey. We don't know what the C or the A in its name stand for, but the S is code for salvation, which just means that it was used in war. It was a ship that could cleanse the galaxy through holy fire. And they're further categorized by the UNSC as Class 5 flagship carriers, putting them alongside the Covenant's largest fleet command ships, beneath only the truly colossal CSO-class supercarriers. Unlike other lighter carriers like the Ruma, which specialized in troop transport and deployment, or the immense Shawada pattern supercarrier, which did serve as a mobile invasion platform, the CAS was optimized for fleet command and offensive naval warfare, functioning as a nerve center for major Covenant armadas. That's why it had such unique tech to protect that leadership. And there are a bunch of famous vessels of this class that become known throughout the Covenant and post-Covenant history. The most notable was Seeker of Truth, the flagship of the Fleet of Particular Justice, under Supreme Commander Thel 'Vadamee, and this was used during much of the Human Covenant War. Another was Resplendent Fervor, which served as the flagship of the Third Fleet of Glorious Consequence. And during the violent years that followed the Covenant's collapse, Song of Retribution became the personal flagship of Jul 'Madama, while Breath of Annihilation eventually entered the service of Sally Nyan's Splinter faction. Though most famous overall has to be Shadow of Intent, the flagship of the Fleet of Retribution, and personal command ship of Special Operations Commander Ratis Vadam, one of the most respected Sangheili military leaders of the post-war era. So this ship outlived the Covenant and may have entered service by around 2135, so more than 4 centuries before the end of the Human Covenant War. Though this longevity was not unusual for Covenant warships, a lot of them are trying to emulate and at times even working in Forerunner tech. And just think about it, Forerunner technology has been laying there dormant and yet still operating just fine for over 100,000 years. But only a few years after it entered service, it takes part in one of the Covenant's most significant political events, the incorporation of the Ungoi into the Covenant hierarchy in 2142. Massive Covenant fleets arrived over Balaho with the intent to impose salvation, and assault carriers were among the imposing vessels present during these negotiations. 3 centuries later, at least one Carol pattern was seen glassing the planet as punishment for this uprising, and this event became one of the defining examples of the Covenant's willingness to employ overwhelming force against even its own client species. During the Human Covenant War, they quickly became some of the most feared ships. If you saw a CAS, you knew that the Covenant was devoting enormous resources, that this would not be some hit-and-run thing that you could try and survive, maybe just evade the Covenant. This ship meant that the Covenant was here to stay. And by the final months of the war, we see many of them assigned to reinforced fleets converging on Earth. With nearly 3 decades of warfare, humanity's homeworld had finally become the ultimate objective of the Covenant's campaign of extermination, and the hierarchs committed all their assets to this goal. Near the end of the Battle of Mombasa, multiple assault carriers joined the massive Jiralhani excavation fleet dispatched by the Prophet of Truth, and these vessels worked alongside the surviving battlecruisers of the Fleet of Sacred Consecration to complete the glassing of portions of the city while simultaneously excavating the Forerunner structure hidden beneath the surface. We're coming full circle here in that it's these ships that are doing the excavating again, their original religious goal of finding these divine Forerunner artifacts. During the fighting, one carrier emerged from Slipspace near Alpha 9's position. It nearly destroyed the ODST squad as they escaped aboard a captured Phantom dropship. When the battle for Earth finally drew to an end, we see several of them with the Prophet of Truth's fleet going through the enormous portal at Voi leading to Installation 00, the Ark, where they would all partake in the final campaign of the war. The Shadow of Intent was involved, and after pursuing a flood-controlled vessel to Earth, the carrier arrived in time to assist in containing the outbreak through a limited glassing operation over the infected region. Later, Shadow of Intent and its escorting warships fought alongside the remnants of the UNSC Home Fleet's 7th Fleet during the climactic battle of Installation 00, where they would destroy Covenant loyalist naval forces while simultaneously drawing attention away from the ground campaign in this effort to eliminate the Prophet of Truth. But as soon as the Covenant leadership was removed, Human, Sangheili, and Jiralhani forces all retained whatever vessels they had. And this is how they continue to play a role in shaping conflicts all across the Orion arm of our galaxy. Shadow of Intent would be in a prolonged struggle against a faction led by Tem Behetek, Sanshayum radicals who hoped to punish the Sangheili for what they perceived as betrayals during the Great Schism. But Ratas would choose peace in the aftermath. Once he did defeat this faction, he directed his attention toward locating surviving Sanshayum populations and building a new relationship with the Sangheili, opening up a new chapter between these two species without the Covenant. Around the same time, in 2554, Julmadama commanded Song of Retribution, as the flagship of what he saw as just to be a continuation of the Covenant. From its command decks, he orchestrated efforts to gain access to Forerunner Shield World Requiem, with hopes of rebuilding Covenant power. And by 2557, this ship was leading fleets composed of numerous Xanar pattern light cruisers and all sorts of other surviving Covenant ships. Those are the named vessels, but there were many that just served different Sangheili keeps, independent warlords, mercenary organizations, and just about any other force you could think of. By the late 2550s, we see one used as the site for peace talks hosted by Arbiter Thelvadam and the Jiralhani chieftain Lydas. So at least 4 centuries after the class was first introduced, it still was what it was always intended to be, this flagship and symbol of military might. That's it for the breakdown. Please, if you can hit that like button, I really do need your help. And check out my store link down below. Tons of cool stuff from all sorts of fandoms. I'm sure you'll like something. But most important of all, remember, Covenant engineering is so advanced, if they wanted to put in some redundant systems to save your life, they would have. And may the domain preserve you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This breakdown is going to pull from every resource available. Please hit that like button, I could really use your help. But let's look at the Ceudar pattern supercarrier, or as it's called by the UNSC, the CSO class supercarrier. This is among the most powerful and imposing warships ever fielded by the Covenant, entering service during the Fourth Age of Conversion. I've mentioned a million times that we have no way of converting those ages into our human calendar time, but that very well could be hundreds of years ago. And this class served as the strategic command vessel, fleet flagship, occupation headquarters, and mobile center of government for major Covenant military campaigns. And just keep in mind that with all the Covenant ships, what humanity designates as a class can often cover multiple patterns, a bunch of individual types of ship, but they all serve the same role, and honestly are almost identical. Technically, the Ceudar pattern isn't the only thing that fits as a CSO class. And even within the Covenant Navy, which famously has all sorts of gigantic warships, almost always dwarfing the UNSC counterpart, the Ceudar stood apart as one of the largest vessels ever constructed, at a length of 28,960 meters, or just under 18 miles long. It was more than 5 times the greatest ship ever built by humanity, the UNSC Infinity, or 54 times the Paris class, while its width of 11,447 meters, or 7 miles, it's about half as wide as Manhattan is long. Or if you'd rather visualize it this way, it's more than 3 times the width of Manhattan. And at 152 billion tons, it's the equivalent of almost 203 billion Girohani, the brutes, or 167 times the Infinity. You might be surprised at how much heavier it is when it wasn't that much bigger in size, but Covenant ships are always magnitudes more dense, due to the technology of their armor and shielding and the reactors to power that shielding. And so you see why this really is a mobile fortress. But to put some respect on the Forerunners, it still doesn't even come close to things like High Charity, and a length, or height, however you want to think of it, of 505 kilometers, or 314 miles, and a mass of 100 trillion metric tons. But it's at least the closest thing since the fall of the Forerunners, the greatest vessel made of this era. While visually it still resembles the Carroll pattern assault carrier, with that iconic Covenant design language of sweeping curves, the bulbous hull sections, and distinctive hook-shaped prow. But it does have a darker coloration, and of course at that size you weren't mistaking it for a Carroll. Though I like to think that some legends might have spread about this thing. It's almost like certain animals, or maybe an exotic car or something. You can imagine some UNSC troopers seeing a Carroll pattern show up, which was an enormous ship, and thinking, damn, is that the Ceudar? And some more experienced vets saying, you'll know a Ceudar when you see it. At its size, you really couldn't mistake it for anything else. And how it was treated in UNSC naval doctrine also reflects this, as war games and tactics that were laid out for how to strike this thing read more like a planetary invasion, not normal capital ship combat. And same thing on the Covenant side. This was not just another ship or just a great flagship, but truly like a mobile command base. When you're operating something as enormous as the Covenant fleets, this ship would be more important than almost anything humanity even had a frame of reference to. It was coordinating so many assets, then even saying it's like the capital of some country during a war on Earth, it doesn't even come close to understanding the magnitude of this ship. I want to compare it to Earth in the sense of how important it was, but that's what's terrifying about the Covenant, is that they did have multiples of these ships. It wasn't as important to them as Earth was to humanity. So in one sense, yes, it's this crucial asset for managing multiple star systems, almost like the capital of a mini empire, if you will. And yet, if somehow this was destroyed, it could be replaced, which is just truly a depressing thought for UNSC High Command. And that was a lot easier said than done, as the hull was protected by those advanced nanolaminate armor materials, with the plating reinforced by those powerful energy shields, while 3 massive repulsor engines provided sublight propulsion, and the Covenant Ceudar Slipspace drive was quicker, more accurate, and more efficient than anything humanity had to offer. And although the exact crew complement is unknown, we do know it's operated primarily by Sangheili personnel, and undoubtedly housed thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of warriors, and was operated by a small army of technicians, navigators, pilots, and as always, religious officials. The larger the ship gets, the more likely it is to serve this religious function as well. And it's funny to say what role it plays other than just command, because of course it could operate as a carrier with enormous amounts of vehicles, aircraft, support personnel, and infantry, but also it's a destroyer and battleship. It has all the weaponry you could ever want. And seen during the invasion of Reach, the supercarrier Long Night of Solace deployed a ton of Covenant forces directly to the planet's surface by using massive teleportation spires. This is something we actually don't see with other Covenant capital ships. This is a great example of the Covenant adapting old Forerunner tech. You see that so many of those old Forerunner sites are just portal happy, while these are based on slipspace translocation tech. And things the size of dropships like Phantoms would materialize in this space between the upper and lower main sections of the spire structure. And they weren't just used on Reach, but also during the Battle of Arcadia. As for its armament, the primary anti-ship battery consists of 12 Erpion pattern super heavy plasma lances, one of the most powerful direct fire weapons ever employed by the Covenant, with these devastating energy weapons just vaporizing several feet of titanium A-plate armor, slicing through the toughest UNSC ships like butter. Now, although a lot of these look the same, they're of varying power levels, so only a few Covenant vessels have ones that are this strong. We see them on the Rassus pattern interdictor, which has rare Forerunner-derived relic lances, and these do rival the Shawadas. But supporting those primary weapons were 20 Ukwa pattern heavy plasma beam arrays and 8 Luxor pattern heavy plasma beam emitters, giving the ship an insane total of 100 heavy plasma beam weapons, each of those being strong enough to take out any UNSC ship. Those Luxor pattern emitters are commonly mounted aboard the Covenant's most powerful warships, like their assault carriers and even major command ships, whereas here on the Shawada they're just backup. And then it still has 32 Myctics pattern heavy plasma torpedo silos, similar to the guided plasma torpedoes employed by the Carroll pattern and Siphon pattern assault carriers. You could argue that plasma torpedoes were one of the more feared weapons during the Human Covenant War, because they were capable of tracking enemy vessels, even going around objects in the way. Over the nearly 30 years of war, the UNSC did develop tactics to try and stay out of the way of these line-of-sight laser beams, but they could just fire volleys of plasma torpedoes that would just hunt down the enemy while you were still delivering other attacks. So this combined effort of plasma lances, beam arrays, and torpedoes all made it the deadliest thing you could come across on offense. But its armament for defense was also extraordinary. To protect this command center from fighters, bombers, missiles, and smaller attack craft, it had a colossal network of pulse laser turrets, a defensive grid that included 800 Ra'aka pattern rapid-fire pulse lasers and 490 Ferial pattern pulse lasers, for a grand total of 1,290 point defense weapons. For comparison, the common Ket pattern battlecruiser only had 50 pulse lasers. The resulting defensive screen here would have made attacks by conventional strike craft exceptionally difficult, to the point that most would have just seen it as not worth it. If the Covenant was willing to dedicate a Shawada to something, your best option was likely just to evac. And while of course it was also equipped with the Lux pattern super heavy excavation beam, infamous for their glassing operations, these were actually originally developed to excavate buried Forerunner structures. That's why it's called an excavation beam. Like we saw with the portal at Voy, over the eons since the Forerunners vanished, a lot of these Forerunner structures were deep under the planet's surface. And this device really does perfectly summarize the Covenant, having this dual religious and military role. Each ship was a functioning cathedral, or even like a religious university, where even during fighting, there were religious experts on board that were reminding everyone involved of how any individual battle or conquest played its larger role in the great journey. And while some of the ship's assets were off fighting, other assets might be actively on some archaeological mission, just like what we saw with the ORS-class heavy cruisers. And speaking of those three-letter designations, we don't know what the C stands for. It's probably not Covenant, because the other ones are not that obvious. The S stands for Salvation, showing that it would save souls through the burning with holy fire, which just means it was a dedicated warship. and the O is for ordained, showing that this is a vessel enhanced with Forerunner-derived tech. It has been ordained or blessed by the Forerunners. And the engineers knew that they could lose that blessing, i.e. they could do something to screw up the tech and cause some catastrophic chain reaction that destroyed the entire ship. Again, this blending of abstract religious concepts with very practical technology. And besides just that 3-letter designation, they're also dubbed Class 5 flagship carriers, which recognizes their central role in directing major Covenant military operations. The most famous vessel of the class was the Long Night of Solace, flagship of the fleet of Valiant Prudence, and during the Fall of Reach in 2552, this enormous supercarrier served as the spearhead of the Covenant invasion force. From orbit, it coordinated fleet operations, deployed occupation forces, and demonstrated the overwhelming strategic power that made the class so feared. And it would famously take out the UNSC frigate Grafton, but is most remembered for how it was heroically destroyed. Eliminating the Long Night of Solace became one of the most significant victories ever achieved by humanity during the Human Covenant War. During Operations Uppercut and Left Jab, Spartan George 052 transported an improvised slipspace bomb, delivering it via the Covenant corvette Ardent Prayer, personally guiding it toward the supercarrier, while Spartan B312 ensured the vessel remained on course.
Bad news is, time is fried. I'm gonna have to fire it manually.
That's a one-way trip.
We all make it sooner or later. Better get going, Six. They're gonna need you down there. Listen, Reach has been good to me. Time has come to return the favor. Don't deny me this. Tell him to make it count.
And the resulting slipspace rupture destroyed both Ardent Prayer and the colossal Night of Solace, eliminating the largest Covenant warship ever encountered by humanity, and getting revenge for their destruction of the second most important human world, as Reach really was just behind Earth in that sense. George's sacrifice deprived the Covenant of a strategic flagship at a critical stage of the Reach campaign, and provided this moral support, showing that even this seemingly invincible CSO-class supercarrier could be destroyed with human ingenuity. The spreading of this heroic story may have saved countless lives during the subsequent invasion of Earth, an attack that would lead to the final downfall of the Covenant Empire. That's it for its breakdown. Please hit that like button. I really need your help. Check out the store linked under the video. Tons of cool stuff from all sorts of fandoms, and anything you buy there helps to keep this channel running. But most important of all, remember, human ingenuity triumphs over even the greatest alien defenses. And may the domain preserve you. Always.